The man known to history as Emperor Frederick Barbarossa was born in mid-December in the year 1122 in Haguenau, in what is now the region of Alsace in eastern France. He was christened simply as Frederick, and the name Barbarossa was a nickname he would acquire later in his life on account of his facial hair. Barbarossa literally means red beard in Italian. His father was Frederick II, Duke of Swabia. This was a large duchy which covered the region approximating to southwestern Germany today and straddled the borders of France, Switzerland, and Austria. The Duke was one of the heads of the Hohenstaufen family in Germany, a dynasty which was just beginning to play a major role in the politics of Europe in the High Middle Ages. His mother was Judith of Bavaria, a daughter of Henry IX, the Duke of Bavaria. She and Frederick Sr. had only recently married, and Frederick Jr. was their first child. At some unknown time in the years that followed, possibly in 1123 or 1124, she gave birth to a second child, a daughter named Bertha, also known as Judith. However, the union produced no more children, and Judith died prematurely in 1130. As a result, young Frederick had only vague memories of his birth mother and would have grown up more familiar with his stepmother, Agnes of Saarbrücken, whom Frederick Sr. married soon after Judith's death. In order to understand the course of events which would catapult young Frederick to the forefront of European politics in the second half of the 12th century, we need to look back at the often rather confusing political landscape of Europe as it evolved during the course of the Middle Ages. After the centuries of instability following the collapse of the Roman Empire in Western Europe in the 5th century AD, the king of the Franks, Charlemagne or Charles the Great, succeeded during the second half of the 8th century in building up a very substantial empire which extended throughout most of modern-day France, Switzerland, the Low Countries, much of Germany and parts of Austria and Italy. As a result, on Christmas Day in the year 800, he was crowned in Rome by Pope Leo III as the Holy Roman Emperor, and his lands were designated as being the Holy Roman Empire, a successor state to the earlier Roman Empire, a move which was given formal sanction by the Church. This Holy Roman Empire, or Carolingian Empire, continued to be ruled by Charlemagne for some years, and although it passed intact to his son and successor Louis the Pious, when Louis died in 840, the empire was soon divided between his sons, and then, in turn, those sons divided up their lands, meaning that by the 10th century, the Holy Roman Empire and the Carolingian Empire were heavily fragmented. The Holy Roman Empire did not survive in the west of Charlemagne's empire, where the Kingdom of France emerged as a separate entity during the course of the 10th century. However, it did survive in Germany and Italy, where the title of Holy Roman Emperor passed to several families after the direct Carolingian line died out in Germany in 888. But because of the rapid division and fragmentation of the Carolingian lands throughout Germany and Italy in the 9th and 10th centuries, there were dozens of competing duchies and lordships throughout Germany by the time of Frederick's birth in the 12th century. Many of the rulers of these duchies had a claim to the title of Holy Roman Emperor. Should the male line of the Salian or Salic dynasty, which had served as Holy Roman Emperors since 1027, die out. At the time that Frederick was born, the emperor was Henry V, who had been King of Germany since 1099, and Holy Roman Emperor since 1111. His power varied across the course of his reign, as many of the more powerful dukes of Germany would often ignore his commands, while the only other major area of the former Carolingian Empire over which the Holy Roman Emperors still exercised a nominal control was Italy. But here, the many cities and towns of the north were de facto independent by the early 12th century. It was with these two regions of the former Empire of Charlemagne that Frederick's political life would be concerned. When Frederick was just 3 years old in 1125, the Holy Roman Empire was cast into turmoil when Henry V died without an heir. When this occurred, Frederick's father, the Duke of Swabia, was considered as a leading candidate to succeed as King of Germany and to seek election as Holy Roman Emperor. The Hohenstaufens were indirectly descended from the Carolingians through several centuries, and the Duchy of Swabia was a stem duchy which had emerged in the 10th century following the complicated fragmentation of the Carolingian Empire. Moreover, when Henry V had been forced to head south to Italy in one of his many clashes with the papacy in Rome for control over affairs in Italy, Frederick Sr. had often been appointed by the emperor to oversee affairs in Germany during his absence. Indeed, it is believed that Henry wished for Frederick to succeed him, but Frederick proved his own worst enemy in this regard. When the German lords and bishops met at the city of Mainz shortly after Henry's death to decide on a new emperor, Frederick alienated many with his overconfidence and unwillingness to accept free princely elections. As a result, a compromise candidate in the shape of Lothair of Supplinburg was elected to succeed as Holy Roman Emperor. It was not an arrangement that would go unchallenged for long. While all of this was occurring, young Frederick was being groomed to become a lord one day. The education of those of noble blood in the 12th century focused on preparing sons to be commanders on the battlefield. He would have learned to ride on horseback from a very young age and how to fight with a sword and other weapons. Armor would have been drafted into this training after a certain point, as the manner in which medieval knights of the 12th century fought involved wearing heavy plate and chainmail armor. All of this came at the expense of what we would view as a normal education nowadays. Many rulers had been illiterate in the early Middle Ages, and while this situation was improving by the 12th century, literacy was still not prioritized. There has been some considerable debate as to how well Frederick could read and write, and while we can probably dismiss earlier claims that he was illiterate, he was no scholar king either, and he had very little grasp of Latin, the language of scholarship, the law, and the church in the High Middle Ages. Thus, Frederick was raised to rule on the battlefield rather than from behind a desk. In 1137, when Frederick was heading into his late teenage years, the stability of the Holy Roman Empire was once again called into question. That December, Lothair III died. He had only one surviving child, a daughter named Gertrude, and the succession was consequently cast into fresh chaos. As a result, Frederick's uncle, Conrad, the Duke of Franconia, now moved to make himself King of Germany and Holy Roman Emperor. Conrad had a long history of seeking the imperial crown. He had challenged Lothair's position back in 1127 and had been declared as a rival emperor, and now the opportunity presented by the imperial throne lying vacant made him the obvious candidate. At a meeting of the German princes and bishops at Koblenz in March 1138, he was elected emperor. However, he faced opposition himself from Henry the Proud, Duke of Bavaria and Saxony. This was the origin of a split within the Holy Roman Empire between the supporters of the House of Welf, of which Henry the Proud was the head, and the House of Hohenstaufen, from which Conrad and Frederick hailed. Eventually, these two camps would become known as the Guelphs and the Ghibellines. The Guelphs is an Italian rendering of Welf, while Ghibellines is an Italianized form of Weiblingen, the name of the ancestral seat or stronghold of the House of Hohenstaufen in Württemberg in Germany. The split between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines would shape much of Frederick's later life. Conrad would rule as Holy Roman Emperor, albeit with some opposition from the House of Welf or Guelphs throughout the 1140s. Frederick's path, though, in these years lay elsewhere. By the early 1140s, Frederick was emerging as a substantial character within Germany as he entered his adult years. He sat at several Hoftages or imperial assemblies under his uncle's rule at various German cities between 1141 and 1145. By this time, the distinctive red beard which he came to be known for was visible. However, Frederick's destiny in the second half of the 1140s was not shaped by events in Germany or Italy, but by occurrences much further away. All the way back in 1095, Pope Urban II had preached of the need for a crusade or holy war to the Holy Land to reclaim Jerusalem for Christianity from the Muslims who had conquered the region. The first crusade between 1096 and 1099 had been extremely successful, resulting in the establishment of several Crusader states around Jerusalem, Antioch, and other cities, including a newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem. However, in 1144, a Muslim ruler of the Middle East called Imad al-Din Zengi reconquered the city of Edessa from the Christians. This led a leading churchman, Bernard of Clairvaux, to preach on the need for a second crusade to be undertaken. While he was visiting the city of Speyer in 1146, Frederick would soon be involved. Unlike the First Crusade, which was led by several leading nobles but did not involve any of Europe's major monarchs, the Second Crusade was soon joined by the Holy Roman Emperor Conrad III and the King of France, Louis VII. Frederick took the cross himself, a symbolic gesture which indicated the intention to go on crusade early in 1147, and committed himself to travelling with his uncle to the Holy Land. This was despite the objections of his father, the Duke of Swabia, who was dying and wanted his son and heir to remain in Germany to cement his control over the duchy when he passed away. In the event, Frederick Sr. died early in April 1147, and Frederick succeeded him before he ever left for the Holy Land. Thus, when Frederick led Swabia's contingent from the city of Regensburg in late May 1147 off towards the Holy Land, he did so as Duke of Swabia, and they did so along with contingents of tens of thousands of other crusaders who set off from various places around Europe. Some headed by sea from England and won a notable victory before they ever left Europe by landing on the Iberian Peninsula and conquering Lisbon from the Muslims there for Portugal. Most, though, headed by land, and by the late summer of 1147 were crossing through the Byzantine Empire, ready to make their descent on the Holy Land. The journey through the Byzantine Empire and then Turkey proved a pivotal episode in the Second Crusade. As they were passing through the empire's lands in the southeast of the Balkans towards the city of Constantinople, flash floods ravaged the Crusader camps in early September. Significant damage had been inflicted on Conrad and Frederick's forces as a result of this, and this was compounded in the weeks that followed as they passed over the Bosphorus and into Anatolia in what is now western Turkey. For weeks in the autumn of 1147, the German armies were confronted by raids and ambushes on their forces by the Turks of the region. Eventually, frustrated in their efforts, they sent messages ahead to the French under Louis VII to request his aid. The French subsequently joined up with the German Crusaders, but when Conrad himself fell sick, the combined forces retreated back to Constantinople. Consequently, it was a demoralized Crusader force which left Constantinople in ships acquired from Emperor Manuel I Comnenus, the Byzantine emperor, having abandoned their plans to march overland. Thus Frederick, Conrad and their German Crusaders finally arrived to the Holy Land, where they sailed into the port town of Acre on the 11th of April 1148. This trip to the Holy Land had been an inauspicious beginning to the Second Crusade. It was compounded when they learned that King Louis's French forces, which had stubbornly maintained their overland march through Turkey, had been all but wiped out along the way. Louis had arrived in Antioch a few weeks earlier with the remains of his army, but they could now offer little to the military capabilities of the Second Crusade. Having learned this news, Conrad and Frederick proceeded from Acre to Jerusalem to visit the holy places and consult with the King of Jerusalem, King Baldwin III. A decision was taken at this juncture to hold a major council of the European kings and their lords, with the lords and rulers of the Crusader state at Acre in midsummer 1148. At the resulting Council of Acre, held at Palmyra just outside the city on the 24th of June 1148, a decision was taken to effectively change the goals of the Second Crusade. The crusade had been called for the purpose of reclaiming the city of Edessa from the Muslims, but now the loftier target of seizing Damascus, the capital of the Burid Emirate, which ruled much of Syria at the time, was decided upon. This was a dangerous decision, given that their forces were already much depleted from the losses they had suffered on their journey to the Holy Land. In the weeks that followed, the European monarchs and lords and the heads of the Crusader states gathered their forces in preparation for the siege. Modern estimates of the combined forces which they advanced from Tiberias against Damascus in mid-July have suggested a possible army of 50,000 men, but the likely number was probably considerably smaller. And it is important to note that the bulk of the troops were comprised of recruits from the Crusader states themselves, rather than the European Crusader armies, which had been so depleted by the attempt to travel through Turkey. They arrived outside Damascus on the 23rd of July. What followed was a fiasco. Damascus was surrounded in the 12th century by vast orchards, which limited visibility on the approach to the city, and as they tried to near the walls, the Crusader forces faced constant hit-and-run attacks by the more mobile Burid cavalry. Over the next several days, tactical errors mounted on the part of the Crusaders and a dispute broke out between rival contenders over who would rule Damascus, if by some miracle they captured it. As a result, on the 28th of July, just 5 days after initiating the siege, Conrad and Frederick took their forces back towards Jerusalem and the siege was abandoned. The disaster at Damascus did not immediately bring the Second Crusade to an end. Back at Jerusalem, plans were initiated to launch an attack on the smaller city of Ascalon, and Conrad and Frederick started off with their troops to head there, but quit the enterprise when it became clear that no coordinated response would come from the other Crusaders. And with this, the Second Crusade was over, a costly and complete failure in terms of achieving its goals in the Holy Land. Although King Louis VII of France remained behind in Jerusalem until 1149, Conrad and Frederick made for Constantinople with what remained of their forces in late 1148. On the way, at Thessaloniki in Greece, they reconfirmed an agreement which Conrad had reached with Emperor Manuel of Byzantium while in Constantinople the previous year. This was a deal whereby both sides would ally together to attack the Norman kingdom of Sicily, which ruled the island itself and much of the southern mainland of Italy. This was a part of Europe which would feature significantly in Frederick's own rule in the years to come. And, with this agreement made, Frederick left Conrad and headed off in haste through the Balkans to Swabia, where he needed to shore up his own rule, having left so soon after he succeeded to the duchy in 1147. Back in Germany, Frederick set about consolidating his rule over Swabia. He might have remained a simple duke here for the next several decades, had it not been for events in the months that followed. In 1150, Henry Berengar, Conrad's eldest son, died. He had another child, also called Frederick, but this boy was just 5 years old at the time. Thus, Henry's death in 1150 opened the possibility of the succession descending elsewhere should Conrad die in the near future. And that is exactly what happened. In early 1152, Conrad, who was nearly 60, a ripe old age by the standards of the 12th century, fell ill. And when he died on the 15th of February 1152 at Bamberg in Bavaria, there were just 2 individuals by his deathbed, the Prince Bishop of Bamberg, Eberhard II, and Frederick Barbarossa. We will never know if the tale Frederick and Eberhard emerged from the scene of Conrad's death with was true or not, but it would come to have enormous significance. Conrad, Frederick claimed, had chosen him to be his successor on his deathbed, rather than his 6-year-old son. Whether it was true or not, the lords and electors of Germany wanted to believe it, in order to avoid the chaos that would ensue from a long minority reign. Accordingly, Frederick was quickly designated as the next King of Germany, and crowned as King of the Romans at Aachen on the 9th of March 1152. This effectively made him the Holy Roman Emperor. However, he would have to wait some time for the formal coronation. Frederick quickly made clear his intention to revitalize the Holy Roman Empire and the position of the emperors. For decades, the imperial title had been weakening. In Germany, there were over 1,000 separate political entities, all of which were nominally under the overall rule of the emperor, but which in reality generally paid little more than token recognition to the emperors. Some amongst the Guelphs were openly hostile to the Ghibelline emperors, such as Conrad had been, and Frederick now was. In Italy, the other major area where the Holy Roman Empire still held some sway, Frederick would face opposition from Roger II of Sicily, whose powerful Norman kingdom in the south of Italy would conduct raids further north with impunity. More significantly, the emperors had been weakened in their authority as a result of what was known as the investiture controversy in the late 11th and early 12th centuries. This was a dispute which had arisen between the papacy and the emperors over whether Rome or the current emperor had the right to appoint bishops and archbishops in Germany and Italy. The papacy had won the argument, but it had created a rift between Rome and the emperors. As a result, Conrad had never actually been crowned in Rome as Holy Roman Emperor, and the many cities and towns of northern and central Italy had begun to exercise increasing independence, so that by the time Frederick became emperor in 1152, imperial control over the Kingdom of Italy had diminished almost entirely. All of these issues confronted Frederick when he became emperor in 1152, but he quickly took steps to strengthen his position. Just months later, in 1153, he reached an agreement with Pope Eugenius III, known as the Treaty of Constance. Under the terms of this, Frederick promised to help prevent any efforts by the Byzantine Empire to re-establish itself in Italy, and also to help Eugenius to gain control of Rome again. The Pope had spent much of his pontificate since 1145 at Farfa Abbey, north of the Eternal City, as Rome itself had been taken over by a body of citizens led by Arnold of Brescia, a religious radical who established the Commune of Rome as a patrician government. In return, Frederick affirmed his claim to become the emperor and was attempting to indicate that he did not need papal approval in order to become the legitimate Holy Roman Emperor. Moreover, he was further facilitated in the months that followed by the death of Roger II of Sicily. He was succeeded by his son William, who was not necessarily an ineffective ruler, but was not the equal of his father, who had been one of the most dynamic and energetic rulers of 12th century Europe. Once the Treaty of Constance had been agreed, Frederick began preparing his forces for a campaign into Italy. His actions in the peninsula and how they related to his control over Germany and relationships with successive popes would come to dominate Barbarossa's reign. The country at this time was a patchwork of different political entities, which was almost as confusing as 12th century Germany's political landscape. In the south, the Kingdom of Sicily, which covered the island itself and much of the peninsula south of Rome, was the dominant power. Elsewhere, a number of states, such as the Republic of Venice in the northeast of the country, were also independent, but much of central Italy and the north in the plain of Lombardy was nominally part of the Kingdom of Italy. This was another constituent part of what had been the Carolingian Empire hundreds of years earlier, but which had also fragmented as Germany had. Thus, it included cities such as Rome, Milan, Mantua, Bologna, Florence, Genoa, and Turin, which theoretically owed some allegiance to the Holy Roman Emperor, but which, as we have seen, were independent in all but name by the mid-12th century, and were governed as city-states by their own communes of wealthier citizens. Now, shortly after ascending as emperor, Frederick's mission was to re-establish imperial authority across the peninsula. Frederick began reasserting himself in Italy with an intended campaign against the Normans in the south in the autumn of 1154. With Roger II just having died and the country adjusting to a new ruler, Barbarossa believed this was the time to strike the powerful Kingdom of Sicily. However, no sooner had he arrived into the plain of Lombardy with a field army of about 7,000 men, including 1,800 knights, than he realized exactly how unwilling to obey his commands the cities of the Kingdom of Italy were. Consequently, he immediately changed tactic and instead began a military campaign against the northern cities, forcing Milan to submit to him that winter and completely destroying the town of Tortona in the Piedmont in northwestern Italy. Then he proceeded towards the city of Pavia, from where the Holy Roman Emperors had long based their rule in the Kingdom of Italy to avoid jurisdictional overlaps with the papacy in Rome. Here, Frederick was formally crowned as King of Italy on the 24th of April 1155. With this done, he campaigned further south through Florence and Bologna, all the time making it clear that he intended to exercise greater control of the Italian cities than they had seen from a Holy Roman Emperor in some time. With his control over the north of Italy reimposed, Frederick continued on south to fulfill his promises to Pope Adrian as part of the Treaty of Constance. Thus, in early June, he arrived in Rome, where he had Arnold of Brescia, the religious radical leader there, executed. Then Pope Adrian entered the city and formally crowned Barbarossa as the Holy Roman Emperor on the 18th of June 1155. Even as riots were occurring across the city in opposition to the reimposition of imperial and papal rule. In the hours that followed, Frederick's troops restored order to the city, but by that time there were over 1,000 Romans dead on the streets as a result of the unrest, and thereafter Frederick proceeded south with the goal of finally campaigning against the Normans. yet reinforcements which he had been promised by the German lords never arrived. Consequently, he returned to Germany late in 1155, bringing his first Italian campaign to an end. His goal was now to strengthen his position in Germany before attempting a second campaign in Italy. This he duly achieved by placating the leading lord of the Welfs or Guelphs in Germany, Henry the Lion, by granting him the Duchy of Bavaria in 1156. This made Henry the second most powerful lord in Germany, next to Barbarossa himself. But in doing so, Frederick galvanized the support of the German lords in advance of a new campaign into Italy. It was also in 1156 that Frederick entered into his second and more substantial marriage. Barbarossa had married much earlier, in 1147, prior to his departure from Germany on the Second Crusade, to Adelaide of Wolberg, a daughter of the Bavarian Margrave Leopold III of Wolberg. But the union proved unsatisfactory. It did not lead to children, and Adelaide was suspected of adultery during Frederick's absence in the Holy Land. Accordingly, an annulment was secured in 1153. Then, 3 years later, Frederick married Beatrice of Burgundy, the only surviving child of Renaud III, the Count of Burgundy, as his second wife. As a result, Frederick became co-ruler of the County of Burgundy, an acquisition which provided him with lands strategically located north of the plain of Lombardy in northern Italy. These could now be used as a way to campaign into Italy without having to rely exclusively on bringing his forces over the Alps through the Brenner Pass. The marriage proved happy by the standards of the time, and after several years it also resulted in 11 children between 1162 and 1179. 8 of these were boys, so there would be no question of Frederick not having a surviving heir when he died. With his position in Germany at least temporarily strengthened and having acquired the further boon of control over Burgundy through his marriage, Frederick undertook his second Italian campaign in the summer of 1158, with the goal of further consolidating his hold on the Kingdom of Italy, and then invading the Kingdom of Sicily. This time he was accompanied by Henry the Lion, and enjoyed much greater support from the German lords as a consequence. As a result, when they descended into the plain of Lombardy that summer, Barbarossa's forces quickly crushed a fresh bout of unrest in the city of Milan, the leading city in the north of Italy. Following this, an imperial diet or parliament was convened at Roncaglia near Piacenza. Here, Frederick made it clear that he intended to re-establish imperial authority across Italy, and further efforts to acquire independence by cities such as Milan would only result in fresh military campaigns by him. The warning was not heeded, however, and rebellions sprung up across the north of Italy in the months that followed, notably at the city of Crema, where Frederick spent much of the rest of his second Italian campaign engaged in a siege in 1159. It was while Frederick was engaged in the siege of Crema in 1159 that Pope Adrian IV died. This would have major consequences for the next 20 years of Italian politics, as, at a papal conclave which followed, the favoured candidate amongst the cardinals was unquestionably Roland of Siena, a cardinal and the papal chancellor. But there was a problem with this proposed candidate. Roland was an avowed opponent of Frederick's, who had consistently argued throughout the 1150s that the Holy Roman Emperor was a vassal of the papacy and took his commands from Rome, not the other way around as Barbarossa wanted it. Therefore, when the papal conclave elected Roland and he became Pope Alexander III, Frederick moved to have his closest rival, a Ghibelline candidate, Octavian of Monticelli, elected. Octavian was duly elected by a minority of the cardinals and became Pope Victor IV. Victor was the first of 3 so-called anti-popes, the others being Pascal III from 1164 and Calixtus III from 1168. These were popes who were not legally elected by a majority of cardinals, but who were set up by Frederick as rivals to Alexander III during his long pontificate down to 1181. Thus, Frederick effectively shattered the harmony of the Church in Italy for 22 years following Alexander's election as Pope, as a means of keeping this opponent of imperial authority from having full control of the papacy. The immediate consequences were that Pope Alexander now moved to ally the papacy with the Kingdom of Sicily, against any further incursions by Frederick against Rome or the south of the Italian peninsula. They also began fomenting further unrest in the north, and this was at least partially responsible for a new revolt by Milan in the early 1160s. A lengthy siege followed in 1161 and early 1162, following which the Milanese finally surrendered on the 6th of March 1162, unhappy at having become bogged down in northern Italy for nearly 4 years when his goal all along had been to strike against the Kingdom of Sicily. Frederick exerted a heavy revenge on Milan for having revolted 3 times under his rule already. When the city was entered in early March, his army set about destroying much of it in the hours that followed. The example this set led several other cities across the north, such as Brescia and Placentia, which had also revolted, to surrender, actions which brought to an end Barbarossa's second Italian campaign. Thereafter, he briefly returned to Germany, but it would not be long before fresh unrest arose to the south. It was not all war for Frederick. His reign was also central to what is known as the 12th century Renaissance. This was an early period of political, social, cultural, and intellectual revival throughout Europe following the Dark Ages, which had followed the fall of the Roman Empire. This early Renaissance saw many marked advancements in these fields, which are now seen as being necessary precursors to the later, more well-known Italian Renaissance, which spread throughout Europe throughout the 16th century. One of the foremost elements of this earlier 12th century Renaissance was the emergence of Europe's first universities. These typically emerged where groups of students pooled their financial resources together to hire scholars to teach them. The first such university to emerge anywhere in Europe was in the Italian city of Bologna. Some studies place the foundation date to 1088, but what is generally agreed is that the university here was given a formal foundation in 1158, when, at the beginning of his second Italian campaign, Frederick issued what is known as the Authentica Abita, a document which set out for the first time what the rights and responsibilities of both the students and teachers at the University of Bologna were. This was a highly important formalization of the university here, and in the early 13th century, the model provided by Bologna was imitated by the universities of Oxford and Cambridge in England, Paris in France, Salamanca in Spain, and Padua in Italy. Another element of this 12th century Renaissance which was characteristic of Frederick's reign was the revival in interest in different forms of legal systems. During the medieval period, the legal systems of kingdoms such as England and France and other entities such as the Holy Roman Empire had come to increasingly be a combination of canon law or church law and the common law, which was effectively a distillation of earlier Germanic laws and the Roman civil law. However, during Frederick's reign, there was renewed interest in different legal systems, with an increasing number of lawyers being hired by governments such as Frederick's. Thus, there was a revival of interest in the Roman civil law at Frederick's court, and also alternative legal systems such as the Justinian Code, a legal code which had been developed by the early 6th century Byzantine Emperor Justinian. Much of this revival was purely motivated by self-interest on Frederick's part, as he sought to use legal arguments to justify his attempts to have greater jurisdiction than the papacy in Rome over parts of Italy. But it is significant that it was revived as a result of Frederick's reign, and the Roman civil law went on to fundamentally influence the legal systems of modern Europe in due course. It is interesting to speculate, given these administrative and educational reforms, how Barbarossa's reign might have developed had he not engaged in determined efforts throughout it to re-establish imperial control over Italy. But ultimately, his attentions were focused on the southern peninsula. No sooner had he returned to Germany in 1162, after his second Italian campaign, than he was planning a third for 1163. This one again aimed at finally campaigning against William I of Sicily in the south. However, the third Italian campaign would yet again be diverted following the emergence of a new independence movement in the urban communes at Verona and neighboring cities in the northeast, and this time Frederick was unable to suppress these, in the same way that he had the revolt of the early 1060s, by making an example of Milan. This is because the insurrection was more coordinated. with the cities of Verona, Padua, and Vicenza allying themselves into what was known as the Veronese League, which also acquired the aid of the independent and powerful Republic of Venice. As a result, Frederick was unable to tame them immediately following his entry into Italy in 1163, and instead cut the Third Italian campaign short. He returned to Germany and began preparing a fourth, larger expedition. The Fourth Italian Campaign, which Frederick led south through the Brenner Pass and into Italy in 1166, was a more formidable affair than the Third Campaign a few years earlier, and this time Barbarossa had a different approach. Rather than striking at the cities of the Veronese League and other recalcitrant elements amongst the cities of the plain of Lombardy, he would pass through the north entirely and move against Rome and Pope Alexander III, whom he believed was the major prop holding together the rebellious cities in the north. Frederick was also doubtlessly perturbed by rumors that the Byzantine Emperor Manuel I had sent emissaries to Alexander offering to end the Great Schism which had developed between the Roman Catholic Church in the west and the Greek Orthodox Church in the east, over several significant doctrinal and procedural differences between the two churches, if the Pope would recognize Manuel's rights to land which had previously belonged to the Roman Empire in Italy and elsewhere. If Alexander was so inclined, then Manuel would send aid to Italy to help the Pope in his struggle with Frederick. Thus, Barbarossa had more reasons than one to strike against the papacy in 1166. The Fourth Italian Campaign, like the Third Campaign a few years earlier, ran into stalemate. Frederick proceeded south and captured Rome after victory outside the city at the Battle of Monte Porzio on the 29th of May 1167. Alexander now fled south to the Kingdom of Sicily and found refuge at the city of Benevento, while Frederick imposed the anti-pope Paschal III in Rome. However, this victory soon turned to despair. Disease struck Frederick's forces in Rome, most likely an outbreak of malaria, severely reducing his military capacity. Then news arrived from the north that while he was capturing Rome, the Veronese League there had expanded to include nearly every city and town in the plain of Lombardy, including Milan, Genoa, Bologna, Crema, Cremona, Mantua, Piacenza, Brescia, Modena, Parma, and Ferrara. Leading members of the communes of these cities and towns had sworn an oath at the Abbey of Pontida near Bergamo by the Italian Alps on the 7th of April 1167, creating this new Lombard League. As new members joined every week, and with his own forces ravaged by the outbreak of malaria in Rome, Frederick now decided to postpone his showdown with the Italian cities and return to Germany in 1168. It would be 6 years before he returned for the final showdown. Frederick spent the late 1160s and the early 1170s undertaking reforms elsewhere to strengthen his position in advance of a new campaign into Italy. For instance, economic changes of a kind were made, particularly in the proliferation of mints throughout Central Europe to produce imperial coins. There were just 24 of these in all of Germany at the start of his reign in the early 1150s, but by the 1180s, well over 100 could be found in the same region. He also made efforts to strengthen imperial authority to the east of the Holy Roman Empire, around Bohemia and Hungary, two regions which had been expanding in the 12th century into the Balkans and western Poland. For instance, when a dispute arose in the Kingdom of Bohemia over the succession there in the early 1170s, Barbarossa convened a diet at the German town of Helmsdorf in September 1173, where he championed the cause of Uldrich, a son of the former king Sobislav I. Admittedly, Uldrich did not want the crown and immediately abdicated in favor of his brother Sobislav, who then became Sobislav II, a decision which temporarily seemed to stabilize the situation in Bohemia, although fresh unrest arose in the mid-1170s. By the time that the latter unrest arose in Bohemia, Frederick had already turned his attentions back southwards towards Italy. In 1174, he undertook his fifth Italian campaign, the last major military foray into the peninsula of his reign. For this, he brought an army of over 10,000 troops south from Germany. However, he faced an unprecedented alliance of the Lombard League, the papacy, and the Kingdom of Sicily. with some minor support provided by the Byzantine Empire. At first, it seemed possible that direct conflict could be avoided as negotiations were opened between Barbarossa and the Lombard League at the city of Pavia, but these broke down in the summer of 1175. Months of movements across the plain of Lombardy followed as the League was able to gather an army of in excess of 20,000 men, while Frederick sent north to Burgundy and various parts of Germany, requesting further detachments to be sent south. The reinforcements he received did not meet his expectations, and when the Imperial and League forces finally clashed at the Battle of Legnano on the 29th of May 1176 to the northwest of Milan, Frederick suffered the worst military defeat of his life. The emperor was struck from his horse himself during the conflict and wounded, to the extent that it was briefly believed he was dead. Frederick's defeat at the Battle of Legnano was the turning point in the Italian wars he had engaged in for 20 years. He now accepted that he would have to reach an agreement with the communes and nobles of the northern cities. He had realized that he could not overwhelm them and force them into complete submission as he had set out to do 20 years earlier. But at the same time, the Italian communes of the north knew that they would have to acknowledge some imperial oversight of northern Italy, and they could not go back to the de facto independence they had held for much of the first half of the 12th century. Accordingly, negotiations were entered into between Frederick and the League, with Alexander III sending emissaries from Rome. The result was the Treaty of Venice, which was agreed to at the Trading Republic City on the 22nd of July, 1177. The treaty did not bring about a full resolution to the showdown between the Italian cities and Frederick, but largely concluded that a 6-year truce would hold between the Emperor and the League. In the meantime, negotiations for a fuller, more long-lasting understanding would continue. The Treaty of Venice brought to an end Frederick's military campaigning in Italy, but while he had technically lost the war with the defeat at Legnano, in the end he gained a partial victory in the peace. When the 6-year truce concluded, it was replaced by a new diplomatic arrangement, which was signed at Lake Constance on the 25th of June 1183. The Peace of Constance was a major compromise. The cities and towns of the Kingdom of Italy would henceforth be allowed to manage much of their internal affairs themselves, but they agreed to acknowledge Frederick's imperial claims on northern and much of central Italy. They would owe fealty to Frederick, who would have the right of appointment of some of the senior officials in each city. Office holders throughout the communes would also have to swear an oath of fealty to the emperor, and while the court systems would operate independently in each city or town, citizens there could appeal to the imperial court in Germany if they so wished. Thus, the Peace of Constance guaranteed the Italian cities a substantial degree of internal independence. But Frederick, after nearly 30 years of conflict in Italy, had succeeded in re-establishing a much greater degree of control over the region than many of his near predecessors as emperor had enjoyed. With the wars over in Italy, Frederick was able to turn his attention yet again to Germany, where he sought revenge against those who had failed to adequately reinforce him in 1175 and 1176 before the defeat at Legnano. In particular, he was determined to move against Henry the Lion, the Welf or Guelph leader to whom he had granted the Duchy of Bavaria back in 1156 in order to quell unrest amongst the Welf faction at that time. Henry had failed to support his fifth Italian campaign adequately and had also aroused some enmity within Germany at his accumulation of huge tracts of land. As a result, Frederick was able to place Henry on trial in 1180 on the grounds that imperial law held sway over traditional German law and that Henry could be tried on charges brought by an emperor. Henry refused to appear at the trial and was quickly found guilty in absentia. Frederick then invaded his lands in Saxony, and Henry was eventually forced to submit in November 1181. Shortly afterwards, he was driven into exile for 3 years, which he spent in northern France. Thereafter, he returned to Germany and tried to re-establish himself, but he never regained the authority he had held prior to 1180. Moreover, with the death of Pope Alexander III in August 1181, Frederick found another adversary gone from the scene. If an indication of Frederick's position as the strongest Holy Roman Emperor which Europe had seen for some time were needed, then one was provided in May 1184 when Barbarossa summoned an imperial diet to assemble at the city of Mainz in western Germany on Pentecost. The Diet of Pentecost, as it has become known, saw the great lords of the empire assemble by the river Main there from the 20th of May onwards. Several banquets and ceremonies were held, and there was talk of developing an anti-French alliance with England by the German lords to re-extend imperial control over eastern France. The Diet was widely written about at the time and celebrated for its indication of how Barbarossa had rejuvenated the empire, and a further victory soon followed. In 1186, Frederick managed, despite papal objections, to engineer the marriage of his son, Henry, to Constance of Sicily, a posthumously born daughter of King Roger II of Sicily. This opened the possibility of the Hohenstaufens one day having a claim to the throne of the Kingdom of Sicily, a possibility which, if realized, would see the family and Ghibelline influence extend from Sicily north to the Baltic Sea. And so, the victories which had so often escaped Frederick on the battlefield were accumulating through diplomacy in the 1180s. It was, though, the call of the battlefield which still appealed to Frederick. In 1187, just after he had organized the Sicilian marriage, that call came yet again from the east. The Crusader states were in fresh trouble there. A dynastic crisis had broken out in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, following the death of King Baldwin IV in 1185. The problem was compounded by the fact that the disparate Muslim kingdoms of Syria and Egypt, which were often divided amongst themselves, had been united under a new Muslim leader from Kurdistan. His name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, but he is better known as Saladin, meaning the goodness or righteousness of the faith. In July 1187, his forces won a great victory at the Battle of Hattin, near the city of Tiberias, against a Crusader army where over 10,000 Christian soldiers are believed to have lost their lives or been captured. With the fighting forces decimated, the Crusaders were unable to prevent Saladin from continuing onwards to Jerusalem and recapturing the city after nearly a century in Christian hands. The call now went out from the remaining Crusader states. Help was needed from Europe if they were to survive and retake Jerusalem. And when word reached 67-year-old Frederick Barbarossa, he determined to take the cross again and return to the Holy Land 40 years after his last foray there. Preparations commenced in April 1188 and were to continue throughout the empire for the next year. Frederick would be joined by several senior lords, the most notable being Richard the Lionheart, a prince of England, who would soon become its king following King Henry II of England's death in the summer of 1189. King Philip II of France also took the cross, as did several of Frederick's senior lords such as his son, the Duke of Swabia, Frederick VI, and Leopold V of Austria. With Europe's three most powerful states, England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire in support of it, the Third Crusade was formidable. Barbarossa's contingent alone would constitute upwards of 15,000 soldiers, at least 3,000 of which were knights. Beyond these military preparations, diplomatic envoys were also sent out to the various powers in the Balkans and even the Seljuk Turks of the region around modern-day Turkey, with the goal of securing safe routeways to the Holy Land from Europe. There could be no repeat of the arduous journey from Constantinople to Jerusalem during the Second Crusade, where the Crusaders had been massively depleted before they ever arrived to Acre and Antioch. With all this in place, Frederick took the staff of a pilgrim at his birthplace of Haguenau on the 15th of April 1189 and set out for the Holy Land. Despite the Crusaders' best efforts to ensure a safer passage this time, Frederick would never make it to the Holy Land. The journey through the Balkans and the Byzantine Empire into Anatolia was relatively smooth, though slow. By the summer of 1190, they were in southern Turkey, making their way along the coast towards Mersin, after which they would soon turn south towards Jerusalem. When a shortcut was proposed to Frederick along the Salef River, he took the advice offered to him, but it was a fatal mistake. There are varying accounts of exactly what happened, but all are clear that Frederick drowned in the Salef River near Silifke Castle on the 10th of June 1190. Some suggest that he was weighed down by his armor after falling from his horse, others that he tried to traverse the river. What is clear is that he died, and once he did, much of the German contingent melted away and returned to Europe. Thus it was a much reduced force which his son Frederick led on to the Holy Land, where they variously buried his bones and flesh in Antioch and Tyre. There they joined up with the other Crusaders who had arrived by sea. Over the next 2 years they would fight Saladin to a stalemate, never recovering Jerusalem but forcing the Muslim lord to allow safe passage of Christians to the city. The Holy Roman Empire was weakened in the long run by Frederick's death. He had rejuvenated it and made it strong again after decades of internal strife and political decline during the first half of the 12th century. His eldest surviving son, Henry, succeeded him as Holy Roman Emperor in 1191, following the receipt of news that Barbarossa had died on the way to the Holy Land. Henry VI, as he became, was an effective emperor who built on his father's successes. In 1194, he claimed the throne of the Kingdom of Sicily by right of his marriage to Constance in 1186, and thereafter he even went to war against the Byzantine Empire and extracted a vassalage tax from Constantinople. But Henry died prematurely, possibly of malaria, in September 1197, and this development opened up a period of renewed conflict within the empire. Philip of Swabia, another of Barbarossa's sons, was elected as Holy Roman Emperor in 1198, but a rival contender emerged from the Welf faction in the shape of Otto of Brunswick. Accordingly, for the next 11 years, there were 2 rival emperors, before Philip's death saw Otto become the only unchallenged Welf or Guelph emperor of the High Middle Ages. Henry VI's son, named Frederick after his grandfather, managed to reacquire the imperial title in 1215 and created a strong centralized state much like Barbarossa had 40 years earlier. But his death in 1250 ushered in a renewed period of decline. Thereafter, the Kingdom of Sicily passed to the French House of Anjou in 1266, and imperial authority in Italy slowly collapsed in the late 13th century as fully independent republics began to emerge in Milan, Florence, Genoa, and other cities. Frederick Barbarossa, of course, has had a modern-day afterlife. When the forces of Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, they did so following the plans laid down in what was known as Operation Barbarossa. This blueprint for the conquest of Eastern Europe was variously named Operation Otto and Operation Fritz during the planning stage. However, in the months before the invasion was undertaken, it was renamed Operation Barbarossa at the directive of Adolf Hitler. Hitler seems to have wished to use the name for 2 reasons. Firstly, he believed that it was fitting because Barbarossa had sought to establish a militarily and administratively strong German empire during the 12th century after the Holy Roman Empire had been weakened for several decades, similar to how Germany had been weakened through its defeat in the First World War. Secondly, the Nazis believed Barbarossa had an acute interest in expanding Germany eastwards. But while Christian Europe was certainly expanding into the Baltic Sea region and further east during the 12th century, it was a complete misconception to believe that Frederick Barbarossa had been at the forefront of this eastwards march. Rather, as the foregoing has demonstrated, his primary concern was always with Germany and Italy and the rejuvenation of imperial power there. Frederick Barbarossa is a paradoxical figure and one whose career can be difficult to assess given the sheer complexity of the Holy Roman Empire in Germany and Italy during the 12th century. A casual observer could conclude that his reign was not very successful at all. For instance, his near 40-year term as emperor was bookended on either side by the Second Crusade in the late 1140s and the Third Crusade in the late 1180s. The first of these was a failure when judged by any criteria and achieved nothing in the Holy Land other than a failed siege of Damascus, which lasted less than a week. The Third Crusade was much more successful overall, but Frederick never made it to the Holy Land himself. At home, he was often even less successful. The paramount concern of his reign was to re-establish imperial control over the Kingdom of Italy, and he launched 5 campaigns into the plain of Lombardy between the mid-1150s and the mid-1170s to try to achieve that. Eventually, at the end of these, he was effectively defeated by the Lombard League at the Battle of Legnano in 1176. His loftier, earlier ambition to conquer the Kingdom of Sicily was never even really attempted because his attentions were always on the north of Italy. However, to assess Frederick Barbarossa's career in this way would be to overlook his accomplishments. When he effectively became Holy Roman Emperor in 1152, following his election as King of Germany, the empire had been weakened by decades of decline. Germany was divided between the Welfs and Hohenstaufen factions, or Guelphs and Ghibellines, as they have more popularly become known, and imperial control of the Kingdom of Italy had all but vanished in the wake of the investiture controversy and the clash with the Pope. As a result, the many cities and towns of northern and central Italy were all but independent city-states, ruled by their own communes. Frederick changed all of that. By reaching an accommodation with many of the Welf lords in Germany, he galvanized imperial control over the country, and by engaging in a relentless campaign to wear the Italian cities down between the 1150s and the 1170s, he re-established a degree of imperial rule over the Kingdom of Italy under the terms of the Peace of Constance in 1183. Near the end of his life, he also ensured that his son would become the King of Sicily by marrying Henry to Constance. However, there was one major flaw in all of this. While Frederick was able to revive imperial power in Germany and Italy during his reign, the settlement he reached in both countries relied on strong imperial rule for it to be maintained. When weaker rulers came along after himself and his grandson Frederick II, ultimately the process of political fragmentation in Germany and Italy and the decline of imperial rule recommenced. What do you think of Frederick Barbarossa? Was he a great medieval monarch, or were his accomplishments somewhat illusory? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.
The man known to history as Richard the Lionheart was born on the 8th of September 1157 in England, possibly at Beaumont Palace in Oxford, one of the royal residences of the Angevin royal family during the 12th century. His father was King Henry II of England, who was born in 1133. Henry had taken possession of the French territories of the successors of William the Conqueror in the 1140s, including the Duchy of Normandy and the County of Maine in the north of France, but he had contested for years with his cousin, King Stephen I, for possession of England and Wales. Then, 3 years prior to Richard's birth, he finally ascended to these territories when Stephen died, bringing the extended civil war to an end. Richard's mother was Eleanor of Aquitaine, a formidable woman herself who had earlier been married to King Louis VII of France before divorcing him and marrying Henry in 1154. As the successor to the Duchy of Aquitaine in western France, she had brought this territory to the marriage, expanding the territory ruled by Henry to cover much of northern and western France, in addition to England and Wales. And the dynasty which Richard was born into is known to posterity as the Plantagenets, after a flower of the order of Plantagenista, which Henry II's father used to wear. This family now ruled extended territories on either side of the English Channel, and Richard's life would be spent straddling these two worlds, where the Plantagenets were the royal family of England, as well as a major noble family in France. Richard's early life was typical of a family which ruled over a very disparate dominion. King Henry II was the King of England and Lord of Wales, much as the modern-day state of England has included a close connection with Wales for centuries, but the Plantagenet dominions stretched much further still. As the descendant of William the Conqueror, Henry ruled over the Duchy of Normandy in northern France, along with several other territories in northern and western France, such as the County of Maine. Moreover, as we have seen, his marriage to Eleanor had brought the Duchy of Aquitaine into the Plantagenet sphere of control. As a consequence, Henry's dominions were nearly as extensive as those of the French monarchy in France, with the south and east of the country ruled by the French kings from Paris. However, owing to the peculiarities of France's territorial divisions, the kings of England swore allegiance to the French kings as subjects, as dukes of Normandy, even while simultaneously challenging the French crown for political and military predominance throughout France. As well as this, Henry II oversaw the establishment of a new English lordship across the Irish Sea during Richard's youth. Thus, what is known as the Angevin Empire stretched across England, Wales, Ireland, and most of northern and central France. It was this disparate territory which Richard would one day come to rule over. During his youth, many would not have countenanced the idea that young Richard would one day succeed to the kingship, as he had an older brother named Henry after the king himself, while he also had two younger brothers, Geoffrey and John, and three sisters, Matilda, Eleanor, and Joan, each of whom would play a consequential part in Richard's life at one time or another. As was typical for the age, the upbringing of Richard and his siblings was the responsibility of his mother. Much of it was entrusted to a nurse named Hodierna, to whom Richard later granted a substantial pension in recognition of her service. As is typical of the time, little concrete evidence is available for Richard's youth and education, but we know that he would have received a conventional education for a royal son, insofar as it focused on the art of war. Yet he was able to read and speak Latin to a very high level, while he also evidently had a keen interest in poems and music. Moreover, several Muslim writers would later attest to him having an interest in Arab culture, although it is unclear if this evinces some previous learning on his part or was cited by Muslim authors as a way of suggesting the English king was possessed of a considerable cultural tolerance. Richard's adult life was overwhelmingly connected with France rather than England, and this association began early. In June 1172, he was formally made the Duke of Aquitaine when he was just 14 years old. A year later, he was implicated in the first of a series of internal wars within the Plantagenet family, as Eleanor and her sons allied with King Louis VII of France against their father. During this rebellion, Richard was actually knighted by King Louis, and in the summer of 1173 he saw his first significant military action in Normandy. Just weeks later, his father offered Richard full possession of several major castles in France and half of the revenues of Aquitaine, to which he had ascended largely just in name the previous year. This was initially rejected by Richard, however. The nature of the rebellion changed in November 1173 when Eleanor was captured by Henry II. The fighting continued for months thereafter until Henry the Younger and King Louis elected to make peace with King Henry in 1174. And Richard, who was already showing a surprising degree of independence for a teenager, finally submitted himself in September 1174. Terms were given to the sons, but Eleanor would effectively remain her husband's prisoner for years to come, as a means of offsetting further unrest within the family. Henry II was evidently impressed by his second eldest son's performance during the war. This was a time when familial rivalry, which spilled over into actual rebellion, was not entirely uncommon, and the king would not have viewed his son's revolt as marking a fatal break with them. Accordingly, in the aftermath of the revolt, Henry gave Richard full control of some of the armed forces of the Duchy of Aquitaine, with orders to reduce any rebels who emerged there to peace. This was the first experience of genuine power and rule which Richard would enjoy from 1175 onwards through to the late 1180s. Much of this work focused on quelling any independent streaks among the nobility of western and central France, notably Aymar, the Viscount of Limoges, and Guillaume, the Count of Angoulême, both of whom were inclined to challenge Plantagenet primacy in the region. In 1176 and 1177, this military campaigning even extended as far south as the borders of Navarre, a small Basque kingdom straddling the Pyrenees in both France and Spain. Consequently, Richard began to develop his reputation for military prowess at a very young age, as he was still shy of his 20th birthday at this time when he undertook these campaigns. It was this military ability which later earned him the name of Richard Coeur de Lion, or Richard the Lionheart, a name which was entering into widespread use by the mid to late 1180s. We know a lot about the character of the individual who was emerging at this time from several chronicles composed on him by contemporary or near-contemporary historians and writers such as Ralph of Coggeshall and Benedict of Peterborough. Richard was evidently exceptionally tall by the standards of the 12th century, standing well over 6 foot high. He was handsome, with reddish-blonde hair and a pale complexion. He was known to have a character which favoured military prowess, and he cultivated an image of himself as a great warrior, one who patronised troubadours and poets, though somebody who was also prone to pride and greed and was sometimes quick to anger. He married later in his life, after lengthy negotiations, to have him wedded to Berengaria, the eldest daughter of Sancho VI of Navarre, although the union would never produce any children. This latter lack of children, combined with some contemporary allusions to Richard's sexuality, have led 20th century historians to query whether Richard was in fact gay and did not produce any children with Berengaria for this reason. But this is still open to debate, with the sources proving ambiguous, leading other historians to conclude that he might have actually been bisexual. The late 1170s and early 1180s saw Richard's relationship with his father strengthening, despite the rebellion years earlier. In 1176 and 1177, he campaigned as far away as northern Spain in order to shore up the Angevin Empire's southern boundaries in Aquitaine. Simultaneously, his actions could often prove overly heavy-handed, and there are many instances of his crushing of local rebellions, and in particular the pulling down of castles of those whose loyalties were suspected, leading to resentment and unrest. As one poet of the period, Bertrand de Born, noted, "He besieges and pursues them, takes their castles, and smashes and burns in every direction." Even by the standards of an age which expected warlike behaviour of its rulers, there is the inference here that young Richard the Lionheart's tactics were excessive. Resentment at this brutal suppression of any signs of revolt culminated most notably in the outbreak of a major rebellion within Gascony in southwestern France in the late 1170s and early 1180s, and in the Limousin region towards central France. Richard continued to suppress these instances of unrest, though the degree to which he was responsible for causing them through his own heavy-handed rule over Aquitaine is debatable, given the manner in which his actions were often depicted in an overly positive light by later chroniclers. Underlying all of this activity in the late 1170s and into the early 1180s was continuing familial conflict amongst Richard, his brothers and their father, aggravated by Henry II's ongoing imprisonment of their mother Eleanor, and much of this increasingly focused on the issue of the succession, as Henry II neared his 50th year, which would have been considered the beginnings of old age in the 12th century. Whilst Henry was his eldest son and heir designate, according to the principle of primogeniture, the disparate nature of the Angevin Empire and the antagonistic relationship between Henry and his sons ensured that there was much confusion as to who would succeed to which parts of Henry's dominions, and perennial tensions as a result. Richard, for instance, clearly hoped to secure Aquitaine for himself over his elder brother. This all boiled over in the winter of 1182, when King Henry asked Richard to pay homage to his elder brother Henry. This required Richard to acknowledge that Henry would have some say over the Duchy of Aquitaine in time to come, whereas Richard was clearly pressing to have the duchy separated from the wider Angevin Empire and made his own fiefdom upon his father's death. When this became clear, Henry sent the third eldest son, Geoffrey, to Richard's territories to prepare a family confidence. However, this backfired, and instead Geoffrey entered into a new rebellion with Henry the Younger. 1183 witnessed a dramatic shift in the diplomatic arrangements within the Angevin Empire. On the 11th of June that summer, Henry II's eldest surviving son and namesake, sometimes referred to as Henry the Young King, died of dysentery while yet again in rebellion against his father in central France. Richard was now his father's eldest surviving son and the new heir of the Angevin territories in England, Wales, Ireland, and much of France. On the surface, the reduced number of sons should have made the family rivalries more stable, particularly so when the king's third, Geoffrey, also died in 1186 in largely unclear circumstances surrounding a jousting tournament. Yet, this did not bring an end to the Plantagenet family squabbles, and in the years that followed, the king began to increasingly favour his younger son, John, particularly so following Geoffrey's death. Henry now wished for John to inherit the Duchy of Aquitaine, while Richard would take the rest of his father's lands. Conversely, Richard would not easily agree to his father's wishes in this respect, not least because his long-standing ties to Aquitaine had created a personal attachment to the duchy for him. It was thus in an effort to force his father's hand in this respect that Richard allied with the French king Philip II in 1187. It would be the last rebellion between Henry and one of his sons. The rebellion of 1187 proceeded quickly. Philip II had succeeded to the throne of France in 1180 when he was just 15 years of age. He and Richard would have a long-standing rivalry for over a decade between when they first allied with each other and Richard's own death over a decade later. Yet during the late 1180s, it was a highly amicable relationship. A combined military campaign by Richard and Philip against Henry II in early 1189 culminated in a major military defeat of Henry in the summer of 1189. At a final conference, Henry was visibly ill and is believed to have cursed Richard. He died days later on the 6th of July 1189, leaving Richard as his clear successor. And the new king moved quickly to secure his patrimony. He was invested as the Duke of Normandy 2 weeks later on the 20th of July. Later that summer, he made one of the few very brief visits he ever made to England and was crowned as king there on the 3rd of September 1189. Finally, after over 15 years of internal strife, the political landscape of the Angevin Empire seemed to be settling down. Richard had only his brother John as a rival. He might have posed little threat, but now, just at the moment of his final victory, Richard was preparing to head to a new challenge, one very far away. A call had come from the Crusader states of the Holy Land. The Crusades were an ongoing series of wars which European Christians had been engaged in since the late 11th century to reclaim the Holy Land around Palestine and Syria, especially Jerusalem, for the Christian powers. For centuries after the rise of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the Holy Land had remained in Christian hands, specifically as part of the Byzantine Empire. However, in the 7th century, these territories were quickly overrun and conquered by the Arabs and assimilated into their caliphate, which was soon ruled from Baghdad. Yet, while the loss of the holy places associated with Jesus and his followers was a blow for Christian Europe, it was mitigated by the general tolerance of the Muslim powers, which allowed Christian pilgrims from Europe to visit the Holy Land relatively unimpeded. But in the course of the 11th century, this equilibrium changed as the Seljuk Turks, an aggressively expansionist people from Central Asia, conquered most of the Middle East, threatening the Byzantine Empire's capital at Constantinople and reducing access for Christians to the Holy Land. In response, the Byzantine imperial government appealed to the Christian powers of Western Europe to come to their aid against the Turks. The resulting response led to 2 centuries of crusading activity between the 1090s and the 1290s. In 1095, Pope Urban II first preached the need for a crusade to reclaim the Holy Land for Christianity. This met with a highly enthusiastic response, and tens of thousands took the Crusader cross and headed eastwards, including numerous senior nobles from France, England and Germany. And by 1099, this first crusade had resulted in the conquest of the Holy Land and the establishment of several Crusader states, including a newly established Kingdom of Jerusalem. These kingdoms and principalities flourished for decades, until a Muslim force reconquered the city of Edessa in 1144, triggering a second crusade between 1147 and 1150. Although King Louis VII of France and King Conrad III of Germany went east on this occasion, the Second Crusade met with little success, and things were calm again for years afterwards. But in the 1170s and early 1180s, a new Muslim ruler from Kurdistan succeeded in uniting the disparate Muslim kingdoms of Syria and Egypt, thus encircling the Crusader kingdoms. This warlord's name was Yusuf ibn Ayyub, but he is more widely known by his honorific title Saladin, meaning the goodness of faith. In the summer of 1187, his forces won a great victory at the Battle of Hattin, and that autumn, Jerusalem was recaptured from the Christians. The call now went out from the remaining Crusader states. Help was needed from Europe if they were to survive and retake Jerusalem. Richard had already determined to head to the Holy Land on crusade as early as 1187, as news of Saladin's victory at the Battle of Hattin had trickled into Europe. And in the months that followed, King Philip of France, and indeed King Henry II, prior to his death, had committed to doing the same. These were not untypical acts for leading European monarchs and lords who wished to appear committed to the crusading ideal, but in this particular instance, the Western European monarchs were wholly committed to doing so, and Richard remained committed to undertaking his quest to the Middle East following his accession as king. And so plans were underway to depart throughout the summer and autumn of 1189 and into the winter. The primary goal here was to raise sufficient financing for the initiative, one which would require a considerable fleet to convey troops across the Mediterranean, as well as massive logistical support over several years. A tithe, or 10% tax, was raised to that end to fund the crusade, known as the Saladin tithe, one which had been begun by Henry II before his death. Simultaneously, the church hierarchy of England and of the various Angevin territories in Wales, Ireland and France were coerced into providing thousands of pounds of funding towards the Third Crusade, which Richard was now committed to undertaking in 1190. There were some final preparations to be made in England and France before Richard could depart. The goal here was to put in place individuals in the regions, particularly the various duchies and counties under his control in France, who would prop up Richard's rule during what was sure to be a lengthy absence in the Holy Land. Thus, William Fitzralph, a stalwart of Henry II's rule and one who had shown considerable support for Richard since his accession, was confirmed as Seneschal of the Duchy of Normandy, effectively making him the governor of the large territory of northern France. Champagne de Rochefort was appointed as his counterpart as Seneschal of Anjou in western France, but most significant was the appointment of William de Longchamp, the Lord Chancellor of England, as the head of the government there during Richard's absence. It was a cutting rebuke of Richard's brother John, who might have hoped to be given a greater role in the governance of his brother's dominions during his absence, and his dissatisfaction at this development would lead to several years of unrest while Richard was away, during which John would seek to continually undermine his brother, principally by attempting to usurp his position as king in England, Normandy, and elsewhere. After months of preparations, the crusade was finally ready to depart by the summer of 1190. At this early stage, it would be effectively co-led by Richard and the French king Philip II, and the two kings left Vézelay in central France together on the 4th of July 1190. They separated at Lyon, where Philip led his contingents by land over the Alps through Italy, while Richard elected to make for Marseille to sail along the Italian coastline to Sicily from the southern French port. There were extensive delays during these passages, as much of the fleet, which had been sent from England and western France around the Iberian Peninsula, had been delayed in entering the Mediterranean Sea. Notably, a drunken spree by the soldiers while in Lisbon in Portugal had particularly slowed the proceedings, and so Richard had to hire other ships at Marseille to send much of his forces to the Holy Land ahead of him, and he then conducted a lengthy tour of the Italian coastline to visit locations in the region such as the Medical School of Salerno, a trip which evinced Richard's interest in the new learning of the 12th century Renaissance which was underway in Italy. Finally, he arrived to Messina in Sicily on the 23rd of September 1190. Here, Richard conferred with Philip before the French monarch quickly headed away to the Holy Land. Richard, however, had matters to attend to in Sicily before leaving himself. In 1177, Richard's sister Joan had married King William II of Sicily, known as William the Good. William died in November 1189, and the crown was quickly usurped by an illegitimate contender named Tancred. This Tancred then imprisoned Joan, fearing she would become a focus of resistance to his reign. Having arrived in Sicily, Richard quickly secured her release, but there were serious issues still to be resolved concerning Joan's dowry and valuable household plate. Tensions quickly escalated in late September and early October, and by the 2nd of October, Richard had ordered his troops to disembark fully from their ships and prepare for battle if necessary. When skirmishes broke out between Richard and Tancred's troops 2 days later, Richard ordered an attack on the city of Messina, one which quickly proved successful. Peace terms were agreed on the 6th of October, whereby Tancred paid a huge sum of money to Richard, and a formal alliance was agreed between the two. Simultaneously, ships were sent to Spain to bring Richard's long-promised bride, Berengaria of Navarre, to Sicily, so that the pair could have their long-awaited marriage during the winter of 1190 as they waited to set off for the Holy Land. However, it would not happen here. When Richard finally left his base at Messina, it was several days more before Berengaria finally arrived to Sicily. Richard's Crusader army finally left Italy on the 10th of April 1191, consisting in total of over 200 ships and 17,000 soldiers and mariners. It soon ran into difficulties, but in the long run these would prove highly fortuitous. On the third day out from Sicily, a severe storm scattered the fleet, and by the time the ships rendezvoused near the large Greek island of Crete, it was clear that dozens of ships had either been lost or had gone astray in their navigations. And these included one of the royal ships transporting Richard's would-be bride Berengaria and his sister Joan. This particular ship could not simply be abandoned, and a wide-ranging search throughout the eastern Mediterranean was now undertaken to locate it. Eventually, it was discovered to be at anchor in the port of Limassol on the island of Cyprus. Cyprus had long been a possession of the Eastern Byzantine Empire and was governed by Isaac Doukas Komnenos. Komnenos had recently developed delusions of grandeur and had proclaimed himself Emperor of Cyprus independently of Constantinople. Now, in the summer of 1191, he seized several of the scattered Crusader ships and was considering doing the same with the ship on which Joan and Berengaria were travelling. It would prove a fateful mistake. In early May, Richard arrived in Cyprus. When the self-proclaimed Emperor Komnenos refused to release the captured ships and prisoners, Richard decided on immediate military intervention and attacked the city of Limassol. A surprise night attack quickly saw the capital completely overrun. Although the emperor managed to escape, this effectively robbed him of his treasury and military support. And in the weeks that followed, further resistance was mopped up and Cyprus was brought under the control of the Crusaders. Much of this was achieved by Richard linking up with the leaders of the Crusader states in the Holy Land. One of their primary leaders, Guy de Lusignan, having received word of events in Cyprus, arrived with several contingents of hardened Crusader warriors. De Lusignan was the titular king of Jerusalem, albeit he was a king without a city since the fall of the Holy City to Saladin several years earlier, and he was challenged amongst the nobles of the Crusader states for primacy, notably by Conrad de Montferrat, a claimant to the kingdom of Jerusalem. Guy and Conrad would prove to be the most significant figures, other than Richard and Saladin, in the events which followed in the Holy Land. By the beginning of June, Richard had seized control over the entirety of Cyprus, a rich island nation with notable trade links, and one which would serve as a crucial base for the Crusaders in years to come. In the broader term, Cyprus became an independent Christian kingdom, one which was ruled by the Lusignans for decades to come, and as an independent Christian kingdom down to the late 15th century, making its conquest arguably the most tangible result of Richard's entire crusade. The conquest of Cyprus and the subsequent sojourn there during the summer of 1191 also provided the opportunity for Richard to finally wed Berengaria. The wedding ceremony was held at Limassol on the 12th of May 1191 at the chapel of St. George there. The marriage was designed to potentially unite Navarre and the Duchy of Aquitaine, and thus make it part of the wider Angevin Empire in the long run, but this plan would prove elusive. Richard and Berengaria never had any children, they would remain distant from one another, and it has even been questioned whether the marriage was consummated at all. Nevertheless, the union was celebrated with great fanfare and ceremony throughout Cyprus in the early summer of 1191. Overall, these events would foretell great success for Richard when he finally reached the Holy Land. A great kingdom had already been won for the Crusaders, and the new leader arrived as a successful warrior, newly married. The reality, though, would prove more complex. Richard finally landed near the city of Acre on the 8th of June 1191, over a year after he and King Philip had first left France on the crusade. The Crusader states had been sieging Acre, one of the key cities of the Holy Land in what today is northern Israel, since 1189. This siege was the first major counterattack undertaken by the Crusaders since their defeat by Saladin at the Battle of Hattin in 1187 and the fall of Jerusalem. The siege was largely driven in its early stages by Guy de Lusignan, the king of Jerusalem, and his primary rival for power amongst the Crusader noble households, Conrad de Montferrat. They had been joined in April by the King of France. Now, with Richard's additional strength added to their efforts, the siege finally proved too much to withstand for the Arab holders. On the 4th of July, the defenders surrendered. Terms were negotiated in the days that followed, which allowed much of the Arab garrison to leave unharmed in return for a substantial bounty and the provision of prisoners as sureties for payment of the same. The end of the siege also led quickly to Philip's decision to return to France. He had nearly died of dysentery outside Acre and was willing to return to Western Europe ahead of Richard, where he could make major efforts to undermine Richard, while his rival for power in France remained absent in the Holy Land. Richard was now the undisputed leader of the Third Crusade, but he had yet to meet Saladin openly on the field of battle. This would soon come as Richard continued his efforts to secure the coastline of Palestine in order to use it to solidify the Crusader position and to use it for a fresh drive to retake Jerusalem. And as he prepared to move towards Jerusalem, a notorious atrocity was committed near Acre in late August. By this time, Saladin had missed the payment of the first installment of the ransom which he had promised for the safe passage of the Arab defenders from Acre weeks earlier. And it was owing to this and the difficulties of transporting large numbers of prisoners inland towards Jerusalem that Richard and his fellow Crusader leaders such as Guy de Lusignan and Conrad de Montferrat elected in late August to summarily execute upwards of 3,000 Muslim prisoners before leaving Acre. Richard was evidently heavily involved in this decision, although there is significant debate down to this day as to what extent the action violated the laws of war as practiced in the late 12th century. This done, Richard led his forces south towards Jaffa on the 22nd of August, with his army staying close to the coast where they could be reinforced by the Crusader fleet and its ample resources in the eastern Mediterranean. This latter movement would finally lead to Richard meeting Saladin in the field in the foremost direct engagement between the two leaders of the Third Crusade. The Battle of Arsuf was fought on the 7th of September on the route to Jaffa. For days, Saladin, with a force of some 25,000 men, largely light cavalry, had been harrying Richard's numerically inferior but better equipped and trained force of roughly 10,000 infantry and upwards of 1,500 heavy cavalry. The latter were the foremost fighting forces in the Holy Land during the Crusades, but they lacked the maneuverability of Saladin's light cavalry, a fact exacerbated by Richard's unwillingness to move far from his baggage trains and risk losing their water supplies. When, on the 7th of September, a full-scale battle was finally entered into, Saladin's troops succeeded in breaking the Crusaders' formation early on. However, a counterattack in the afternoon by Richard roused the Christian lines, opening gaps in their infantry lines for the heavy cavalry to strike forward at the much more vulnerable light cavalry. After 3 charges of this kind, the Arab armies were broken and fled into the adjoining hills and forests. Contemporary accounts of the casualties are wildly exaggerated, but it is estimated that as many as 5,000 or 6,000 of Saladin's men were killed for under 1,000 of Richard's. Arsuf was the foremost victory in the field for Richard during the Third Crusade. It opened the route to Jaffa, which the Crusaders reached 3 days later. The walls had been dismantled on Saladin's orders, a decision which effectively surrendered the city to the Christians, but which also ensured that Richard had to spend weeks here until makeshift walls were erected to protect the town for the Crusaders. It was while he was here that Richard began envisaging that the key to securing the Holy Land might lie in striking at Saladin's core dominions in Egypt, and, in particular, by seizing Cairo. and this was a strategy which was eventually widely accepted as being the best available to the Crusaders many years later, during the 13th century. But for now, Richard was overruled by Guy, Conrad, and his fellow Crusaders who wished to strike directly at Jerusalem. Thus, the early winter was spent seizing and garrisoning several castles on the route inland from Jaffa to Jerusalem. Consequently, by the end of 1191, Richard's crusade had succeeded in conquering Cyprus for the Christian cause, as well as retaking the Palestinian coast from Acre to Jaffa, with the route to Jerusalem being prepared for a strike at the Holy City. The latter campaign, though, would never be undertaken by Richard. Early in 1192, Richard's role in the Crusades began to inexorably wind down. On the 20th of January 1192, he reached Ascalon, where plans were initiated to begin refortifying the site as a base from which the Muslim powers' caravans travelling across the Holy Land between Syria and Egypt could be attacked. Yet, when disputes broke out here amongst the leading Crusaders about how this should be funded, Richard withdrew to Acre. Here, further disputes arose between the Crusader contingents, particularly the merchants representing the major trading powers of Italy, on whose financing and supply much of the Crusader states depended, about how to proceed. Consequently, by the late spring, Richard was increasingly faced with the futility of trying to motivate the disparate leaders and groups involved to act in concord. Moreover, it was while at Acre that he received disconcerting news from Western Europe that fresh unrest had arisen back home in his dominions. His brother John was now openly plotting with the French monarchy, and Richard's continued presence in the Holy Land on the Crusades threatened his position as king of the Angevin Empire back home. It was these combined factors which, in the spring of 1192, led him to take the decision to return home without capturing the ultimate prize of Jerusalem. There remained a number of things which needed to be resolved in the Holy Land before Richard could leave. First and foremost amongst these was the issue of the leadership of the crusade after the English king left. Would Guy de Lusignan, the acknowledged king of Jerusalem, or Conrad de Montferrat, his would-be challenger, succeed Richard as the head of affairs? In an effort to resolve this, Richard summoned a council, where he attempted to establish Conrad as the next head of the Crusader states. In return, Richard sold Cyprus to Guy for a sum of 60,000 bezants. But no sooner had this arrangement been loosely worked out than Conrad was killed by a pair of assassins in late April. It is unclear to this day who had hired these assassins, with everyone from Richard to Saladin being suspected for varying reasons. What is clear is that this cast affairs into further chaos. Then Saladin's recapture of the town of Jaffa at the end of July, before Richard himself could relieve the siege, sealed his decision to leave the Holy Land. On the 2nd of September, a 3-year truce was agreed between Richard and his mortal foe. Richard would surrender Ascalon, but the entirety of the coast from Jaffa to Acre was back in Christian hands, as well as Cyprus, and Christians were guaranteed free access to Jerusalem. Hence it was that Richard departed the Holy Land on the 9th of October, having failed to achieve ultimate success by capturing Jerusalem, but having achieved a great deal. Richard's return to Europe was not straightforward. By November 1192 he had reached the Greek island of Corfu, and at this point elected to travel back to Western Europe through Germany rather than westwards through Italy. Richard was conscious in all of this that he was passing through the territory of several princedoms which were opposed to him, notably Leopold of Austria. Leopold was a staunch ally of Henry VI, the Holy Roman Emperor, a would-be leader of any future crusades, and he consequently viewed Richard as his enemy. Aware that to pass through Leopold's territory would involve the threat of falling into Henry's hands, Richard hired several galleys at Corfu and headed north, accompanied by a relatively small retinue of his most trusted followers, hoping to avoid detection while pretending to be travelling pilgrims on their way back from the Holy Land. But the subterfuge did not work. Their ships crashed on the Istrian coastline, and while heading for Moravia in Austria, they aroused suspicion. As a result, they were finally apprehended near Vienna while passing through Leopold's country in December 1192. Within days, news had been sent to the Emperor Henry that King Richard of England had been apprehended and was being held by Leopold in the castle of Dürnstein, northwest of Vienna. The emperor had more than one reason to have apprehended Richard, for Henry was also loosely allied with King Philip of France. Accordingly, we find the emperor writing to Philip within days to inform the French king of the good news that he had apprehended the English king. Back in England, John also became aware of this and moved to pay homage to Philip in an effort to bolster his claims to succeed his brother. However, the church authorities, which maintained that all crusaders were protected against attacks or seizure when travelling to or from the Holy Land on crusade, were less impressed, and extensive pressure was now applied on Leopold and Henry to release Richard. Hence it was that weeks of protracted negotiations to see whether Richard would be released by his German captors and on what terms were entered into. Finally, in late February 1193, terms were concluded in Speyer, after Richard successfully defended himself against trumped-up claims of having abandoned the crusade. Nevertheless, Richard still had to pay a ransom of 100,000 marks and promised to supply the emperor with 50 galleys and the service of 200 knights annually, resources which Henry utilized to launch his own crusade in the years that followed. Further negotiations on these terms ensued, such that Richard was unable to depart Germany until early in 1194, well over a year after first leaving the Holy Land. Richard now set off on the last leg of his journey home. Not everything which had occurred during his absence had disadvantaged his position with regards to John. In 1192, King Philip had stirred up a rebellion in the Duchy of Aquitaine, but this event had demonstrated the strength of some of Richard's alliances. On this occasion, his wife Berengaria's brother, Sancho of Navarre, to the south in the Basque region, intervened during Richard's absence to suppress the revolt. Indeed, Sancho went even further and launched a punitive raid against Toulouse to demonstrate that Richard's French possessions were not open targets while he was in the Holy Land or making his way home. And back home in England, many senior officials who had been loyal to Richard before he departed on the crusade remained so, and did their best to thwart John's efforts to undermine his brother. Nevertheless, other developments did not bode well for Richard. In April 1193, King Philip finally inflicted a considerable defeat on Richard's cause when he seized Gisors in Normandy, perhaps because the Castellan, a senior official there, had proved willing to surrender in the belief that John would soon succeed Richard as Duke of Normandy. All of this indicates that there was fresh unrest as Richard arrived back to Western Europe in the early months of 1194. Richard left Germany in February 1194 and reached England on the 13th of March. He passed through the Rhineland on his way, on which journey he renewed some alliances with the princes and lord of Western Germany and the Low Countries around modern-day Belgium. Having landed in England, resistance to his resumption of the crown was strikingly limited, a result perhaps of John himself being overseas in the Duchy of Normandy. Richard first visited the religious shrines of Canterbury and Bury St Edmunds before proceeding to the famous Nottingham Castle to confront the centre of John's supposed rebellion. Fighting did occur before the castle surrendered on the 28th of March. Thereafter, Richard resumed the full regalia of his English kingship and presided over several meetings of the government at Winchester, before departing for France in early May to confront John head-on in Normandy. He left the government of England to Hubert Walter, who had accompanied Richard on crusade and who had been made Archbishop of Canterbury in 1193. Richard would never return to England, an indication of the degree to which he viewed France as the core component of his dominions, much as his ancestors as far back as William the Conqueror had. Where England had seen little resistance to Richard's return as king and had been quickly stabilised, the Crusader king's return would prove far less seamless in France. John had dug himself into Normandy, where he relied on a close alliance with the French king to cement his position. Thus, by the time that Richard arrived in northern France in the early summer of 1194, John and King Philip had flooded the region with French troops, holding a number of key strategic sites across Normandy as well as other sites, and the French king proved the more loyal and reliable of Richard's opponents. Conversely, no sooner had the English king landed in Normandy than his brother and would-be rival quickly rushed to beg forgiveness from his brother. This Richard agreed to, claiming John had been ill-advised by his counsellors. For his part, John would remain loyal to Richard for the remainder of his reign thereafter. Thus, within just days of his arrival, the conflict switched from a pseudo-civil war between Richard and John to a more traditional war between the King of England and the King of France. And in this, Richard was quickly aided by his familial allies from Navarre, and by mid-June, Tours in central France had been retaken by Richard. The campaign then moved into the Loire River Valley, and after a swift campaign here, he moved south into Aquitaine. By late July, he had captured Taillebourg and Marcillac, the city of Angoulême, Montignac, and La Chaise, thus largely completing Richard's reconquest of his western French territories 3 months after sailing to France from England. Richard's conquest of his French territories, though, would prove more ephemeral than first appeared. In particular, his hold over Normandy was tenuous, and his efforts to fully re-establish his control over the duchy would dominate much of his subsequent reign. In his drive southwards to restore control of Aquitaine in the summer of 1194, Richard had left several castles in the hands of King Philip. Several of these were major strongholds that had been heavily garrisoned in such a way which would require extensive and costly sieges to remove the French. Accordingly, in the late summer of 1194, a truce was agreed, whereby these sites would be allowed to remain in the French king's hands until the winter of 1195, but there would be no fighting between Richard and Philip's troops. On the surface, this arrangement provided both monarchs with advantages. It gave Philip time to rethink his strategic stance, now that the chances of replacing Richard with John altogether seemed implausible, while for Richard this new arrangement would give him a period of 15 months to cement his newly resumed rule and deal effectively with those who had supported John in his attempt to usurp Richard. The truce of 1194 between Richard and the French king proved short-lived. Within weeks of it being agreed, border tensions and skirmishes were breaking out in places throughout France, while by the summer of 1195, full-scale war had effectively recommenced. Richard's approach to this resumed conflict was to concentrate his forces on seizing control of the Auvergne and Berry towards central France, in the border region between Richard's French territories and those of the French monarchy, an approach which quickly bore fruit. By the early autumn of 1195, Philip had indicated that he would relinquish control of any of Richard's territories which he had seized during the king's absence on crusade, in return for a marriage alliance between Richard's niece Eleanor and Philip's son and heir Louis. This proposal, though, proved abortive, and as fighting continued to rage, Richard made further conquests, ensuring that Philip had to agree to a treaty in January 1196. Then, under the terms of this Treaty of Louviers, Philip relinquished all of his major gains from Richard's period of absence, except the Vexin in northwestern France and a handful of border castles. This ended the conflict in central France to an extent, but fresh tensions would continue elsewhere in the country in the years ahead. As 1196 progressed, the war between Richard and Philip changed dramatically as Philip built up a new alliance of powers to combat Richard's rapid ascendancy on either side of the English Channel. These included several major lords from the Low Countries, notably the Counts of Flanders, Ponthieu and Boulogne, who were joined in the North Atlantic by the Duchy of Brittany in northwestern France. And this new confederacy was now able to apply extensive pressure on Richard's shipping lines and logistical supplies in the English Channel. In order to offset this threat, Richard needed to divert much of his land forces to an invasion of Brittany in mid-1196. Yet, even this setback was only temporary. Eventually, Richard was able to force Count Baldwin of Flanders to change sides, firstly by launching a massive embargo on trade and the supply of goods, and then by offering a favourable alliance of his own. Thus, Baldwin went from blockading Angevin shipping in the Channel to invading Artois in northeastern France on Richard's behalf and seizing the considerable French town of Douai. Then, in a remarkable course of events, an alliance of German princes petitioned Richard that they would put forward Richard's nephew, Otto, son of Richard's sister Matilda, and her husband Henry of Bavaria and Saxony, as a potential successor for the office of Holy Roman Emperor, an astonishing diplomatic coup for Richard. While 1197 and 1198 had seen these further successes for Richard, he would not be alive long enough to enjoy their fruits. In the autumn of 1198, Richard elected to complete the final reduction of the Vexin, a small county near Paris itself, from Philip, following the expiration of a new truce with the French king. Pressured by the Count of Flanders in the northeast and by Richard in the west, Philip twice came perilously close to being captured in the campaign which followed, including nearly drowning on one occasion. This virtually completed the conquest of the Vexin, bringing Richard back into possession of all the lands he had previously held, before heading to the Holy Land and placing him in the strongest position any English monarch had held with respect to the French monarchy for decades. This conquest also initiated a major building program in the region, notably the Château Gaillard, 95 kilometers northwest of Paris and one of the most impressive medieval castles ever built in northern France. Along with major work to develop the port of Portsmouth, it constitutes one of the only major acts of administration and government which can be associated with Richard's kingship, a reign which was ultimately characterized almost entirely by war, whether in the Holy Land or back in Western Europe. In January 1199, King Richard met with his French counterpart King Philip in a meeting brokered by Pope Innocent III. A 5-year truce was now agreed to, one which would see Richard's dominions entering into an unprecedented period of peace and stability. It is entirely peculiar that it was during this period of harmony that Richard would be killed, while still in his early 40s. On the 26th of March 1199, he was shot by a crossbow bolt while campaigning to put down a small regional revolt by Viscount Aymar V of Limoges. In the days that followed, without the benefits of modern medicine, the wound turned gangrenous, and on the 6th of April he died from the illness. He was subsequently buried at Fontevraud. Richard was succeeded by John, whom Richard named as his successor during his final illness. The would-be usurper's accession would spell the end of the conflict with Philip when, in 1200, the Treaty of La Goulée saw John confirmed in his French territories in return for acknowledging Philip as his liege lord in France itself. However, it would prove a short-lived peace, and in the years that followed, the French crown would begin to reconquer several parts of the Angevin Empire from the English monarchy, the beginning of a long process which ultimately would take until the 1550s to complete. Overseas, Richard's efforts proved just as transiently successful. Further crusades followed in the years and indeed decades to come into the late 13th century. Some of these produced variable levels of success in places other than the Holy Land. For instance, in 1204, a Christian army seized the Byzantine capital of Constantinople and established a Western Roman Catholic Christian state in the Balkans for decades to come. Others attempted to seize Egypt as the strategic key to the Holy Land, much as Richard had envisaged in 1191. The Sixth Crusade in the late 1220s finally succeeded in capturing Jerusalem, Richard's ultimate goal, which he had been unable to achieve. Nevertheless, this was a fleeting success, and within 15 years, the Holy City was back in Muslim hands. Thereafter, the fate of the Crusader states dwindled, despite efforts by major European monarchs to undertake fresh efforts to reclaim the holy places for the Christian cause. With the fall of the city of Tripoli in 1289 and the siege of Acre in 1291, 100 years after Richard had landed there in 1191, the Crusader cause was extinguished in the Holy Land. It was due in some considerable way to Richard's efforts, though, that these Christian kingdoms lasted here for as long as they did. Richard the Lionheart is one of England's most acclaimed kings, a somewhat strange development given the shortness of his reign. He ruled for just 10 years, half of which period was spent far overseas in Sicily, Cyprus, the Holy Land, and Germany. Yet, it is this period which has also gained him his reputation and made him most famous. For 2 years in the Mediterranean world, Richard led the Crusader effort in the wake of years of losses for the Christian states there, as well as successive defeats to Saladin. It is unsurprising that Richard has captured the imagination in this way, not least because he finally offered a counterpoint to the seemingly invincible Muslim warlord. After the stalemate of the Second Crusade, in the middle of the 12th century, Richard was depicted as the first major Crusader leader to have made significant conquests and territorial gains in the Holy Land since the First Crusade over 90 years earlier. For successive generations of chroniclers and historians since the late 12th century itself, this appearance of the valorous Crusader warrior, named the Lionheart for his courage, was made all the starker when contrasted with the supposedly scheming spectre of his brother John, who back in Western Europe conspired with the French to usurp Richard while his brave brother was away. But while this is the idealized version of Richard and the basis for so much of his legacy, there is also much to criticize about the Lionheart, criticisms which have dominated studies of the king by historians in recent decades. First and foremost, his reign was dominated by warfare. This had started long before his own accession, with the conflicts with his father in the 1170s and 1180s. It continued through his involvement in the Crusades and eased after returning from the Holy Land. While much of the latter conflict can certainly be blamed on others for having usurped some of his territory while he was absent in the East, the reality is that Richard could have negotiated a peace settlement with King Philip long before 1199 if he had been willing to compromise slightly on how many castles in France he wanted to hold. By way of contrast, there is little else of interest within Richard's reign other than his wars. He did build some castles, which again had a military purpose, and left plans when he left England in 1194 for some work to be carried out in his name, but his reign is remarkably bereft of any signature efforts to reform the judiciary, introduce new taxation systems other than those designed to fund his military endeavours, or offer any form of civil government policy which might have substantially improved the administration of his dominions or the lives of his subjects. Perhaps the most balanced appraisal of Richard the Lionheart is one which takes stock of both extremities of his reign. Richard can certainly be criticised for having done little other than make war throughout his life, but that was, after all, substantially perceived to be the duty and responsibility of a European monarch during the High Middle Ages. Moreover, while it is fair to suggest that he could have established peace with France more quickly in the mid-1190s and moved on from there to working on taxation and issues of noble rights, which plagued John's subsequent reign, it is also only fair to note that Richard was responding to aggression which was committed by others. The Third Crusade was launched in response to Saladin's conquests in the Holy Land, and Richard's wars in France were the result of Philip and John's conspiracies while Richard was away on crusade. Finally, while there is no doubting that Richard was over-lionized by historians and chronicles for centuries after his death, it is also true to say that he was the most successful leader of the Crusades in over 90 years. When he arrived, the Crusader states were facing extinction in the Holy Lands, but when he left in 1192, the Christian cause had been rejuvenated and expanded, ensuring its survival for another century. Perhaps in this respect, his most exaggerated legacy is also, paradoxically, his most genuine. What do you think of Richard the Lionheart? Does his brief reign constitute one of the great missed opportunities of English kingship, or are his abilities as a king exaggerated? Please let us know in the comments section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching. The man known to history as King Edward I was born at some stage on the night of the 17th of June 1239, or the early hours of the 18th, at the Palace of Westminster, which was then lying on the western outskirts of the City of London. His father was King Henry III of England, a monarch who had ruled the country from childhood, but was only just beginning to exercise some actual authority himself in his early 30s as Edward was born. Henry was an extremely pious, religious man who was devoted to the cult of St. Edward the Confessor, and he named his eldest son after the saint. His mother was Eleanor of Provence, a French noblewoman whom his father had married 3 years before Edward was born. Henry and Eleanor's marriage was a happy one in a time when royal weddings were often arranged for political purposes. In the years following Edward's birth, she and Henry would have 4 further children, a boy, Edmund, and 3 girls, Margaret, Beatrice, and Catherine. 3 of Edward's siblings would survive into their adult years, but Catherine died before her 4th birthday. Young Edward was born at a time when England was in the midst of considerable political turmoil. His grandfather, King John, who had ruled England from 1199 to 1216, had been a controversial and, in many ways, a weak ruler. In the early 1200s, he had engaged in a series of disastrous conflicts in France, which resulted in the loss of much of England's extensive territories in the north of the country to King Philip II of France, notably the Duchy of Normandy, which had formed the core of the English presence on the other side of the English Channel. Then, in the mid-1210s, John had faced a revolt by his own English lords, known as the First Barons' War. John initiated some political reforms before his death in 1216 in order to quell the unrest, including the Magna Carta, or Great Charter, of 1215, but the succession of Edward's father when he was just 9 years old ensured that there would be no quick end to England's domestic turmoil. Henry III was a pious and in many ways an honourable ruler, but he was ineffective in some other ways and easily dominated by court factions for much of his long reign. Consequently, Edward's younger years were dominated by unstable politics throughout England, further civil strife, an extensive revolt in Wales, and on the international stage, a failure to recover any of England's former territories in France. Eventually, Edward would be sucked into the civil strife of his father's reign, and he would often find himself in opposition to the king's own government. As was typical for royal children at the time, Edward was raised largely away from his parents in his own royal household. Letters from his father demonstrate a fatherly concern for the young prince, though perhaps not of the kind which would be typical today. In 1242, when he was around 3 years old, Henry expressed a concern that Edward didn't have good wine to drink. In his youth, Edward's care was handed over to Hugh Giffard, and then, in 1246, to Bartholomew Peche, a close friend of the king's. Serious concerns arose concerning Edward's health around this time, and these issues did not fully abate until the early 1250s. The details of how he was educated are unfortunately quite scant, but this was a time when there was a greater emphasis on pursuing martial abilities and other pursuits such as hunting and jousting than there was on academic accomplishment for a future king. As a result, Edward would be no scholar king. In the mid-1250s, Edward, who became known as the Lord Edward from a young age, was granted considerable authority over the Crown's possessions outside England, specifically Ireland, Gascony, and Wales, each of which afforded him a large income and gave him a certain degree of independence from his father. From 1256, Edward's official seal was being used in Ireland to indicate his senior position there. In 1154, though he was just 14 years of age, Edward was married to Eleanor of Castile, who herself was a year and a bit younger than Edward. The marriage of the pair, who were barely entering their teenage years, was a political act designed to shore up English power in its remaining French territory of Gascony, which lay just to the north of the Kingdom of Castile in Spain. Despite the arranged nature of the marriage, it was a very happy one. Eleanor and Edward were devoted to each other, and she accompanied him everywhere, even years later heading on crusade with him to the Holy Land. A long marriage which lasted over 35 years resulted in many children. It is believed there were 14 in all, though the exact number is not entirely clear at a time when infant mortality and stillbirths were common. These generally arrived in a 20-year period between 1264 and 1284, though only one son, the future King Edward II, survived into adulthood, as did 5 daughters: Eleanor, Joan, Margaret, Mary, and Elizabeth, although Eleanor would die as well before she reached her 30th year. Thus, at least 8 of their children died in infancy or childhood, a rate which, even by the standards of the time, was unusually cruel on Edward and Eleanor. By the late 1250s, Edward was being pulled into the political strife of his father's reign. Numerous issues, including the perception of the king's fiscal recklessness and his excessive support for the French relatives of the Queen at court, combined to force many of the English lords and some of the powerful French faction, led by an influential political figure called Simon de Montfort, to push Henry into making concessions at a parliament held at Oxford in 1258. The so-called Provisions of Oxford saw many of Henry's French councillors expelled from positions of influence, and the government of England was all but handed over to a group of 15 councillors who were selected from amongst the leading magnates and nobles of the realm. Edward's position in all of this was ambiguous, and he did not overly support his father. Indeed, when an even more radical series of measures, known as the Provisions of Westminster, were forced on the king in 1259, the rebellious lords who implemented these had the support of Edward himself. All of this effectively resulted in a drastic reduction in the king's power, while Edward, who had felt stifled by his father in recent years, attained a greater position of authority within this form of conciliar government of the late 1250s. Though often viewed as a weak king, Henry was not willing to acquiesce with this curtailment of his power. He now moved to acquire the aid of the French king, Louis IX, against his own nobles by formally relinquishing English claims to the Duchy of Normandy and other French territories which had effectively been lost to the French over half a century earlier. In return, Louis provided Henry with financial and military support, with which he returned to England in 1260 and began re-establishing his royal authority. By late 1261, de Montfort had been exiled to France, and Edward had reconciled with his father after much jostling. He was briefly sent to Gascony in France, where he stabilized the region, but as the disturbances in England continued, he was recalled. Then, when de Montfort crossed back from France to England in the spring of 1263, a new opposition movement began to emerge at Oxford. By the autumn, armed clashes between the king and his opponents were occurring, and by the winter of 1263, de Montfort's alliance of fractious lords were able to seize control of London. This time, it was decided to put matters to King Louis IX to act as an arbitrator in the dispute. But Louis sided with Henry and proposed the annulment of the earlier provisions that had been agreed at Oxford and Westminster in 1258 and 1259. Given this, de Montfort and his allies chose renewed war, and what is known as the Second Barons' War commenced. Unlike in the late 1250s, when the Civil War commenced, in 1264, Edward was steadfastly loyal to his father. In April, he played a leading role in the capture of Northampton, where one of Simon de Montfort's sons was gathering a large baronial army. But the war would be won or lost in the south, and early that summer it started to go very badly. At the Battle of Lewes in Sussex, in the southeast of England on the 14th of May 1264, the royalist forces engaged de Montfort's army. Edward led the cavalry on the right wing of his father's army to good effect, but the battle was lost overall as de Montfort's forces occupied a strategic position on the high ground of Offham Hill. In its aftermath, Edward was taken as a hostage and placed under confinement, while Henry was forced to make massive concessions to de Montfort. For all of a year, de Montfort was virtually an uncrowned king of England. But when Edward escaped and began building up a royalist force again in the Welsh marches, the tables turned. He was now effectively the head of the royalist cause, as his father remained a prisoner of de Montfort's. Concerted campaigns throughout the summer of 1165 brought much of the north and western England back under crown control, and de Montfort was forced to engage Edward in the field at Evesham on the 4th of August 1265. Here, Edward outmanoeuvred de Montfort before the battle, who was placed on the defensive from the offset. The result was a crushing victory for Edward, in the course of which de Montfort was killed and the king was finally released. Victory at Evesham did not bring the war to an end. Campaigning continued through late 1265 and into 1266, before the last major stronghold, Kenilworth, was placed under siege. Edward briefly joined this action in the summer of 1266. The dictum of Kenilworth was issued in October, which laid out terms whereby those who had been in rebellion would be able to repurchase their lands from the crown. It was hoped by this that the garrison would surrender, but they refused and held out until December. By then, Edward had gone north to deal with further operations to mop up rebels there. A final push was made by the Lords on London early in 1267. It was led by the Earl of Gloucester, and posed a serious threat that the tide of the war could yet again turn. But Edward entered into negotiations with Gloucester, who was effectively bought off. With this, matters began to wind down. A more conciliatory line was taken towards those who were still in arms, which led to the laying down of weapons in many locations. Edward campaigned to the Isle of Ely in the early summer, which was seized with little difficulty, while a final push into the fens in early July saw the last of the rebels surrender. The Second Barons' War was over, and Edward had played a key role in victory for his father's cause. Plans were quickly initiated to reach a political settlement in order to bring the tensions that had caused the Second Barons' War to an end. The result was the Statute of Marlborough, which was issued in November 1267, whereby some of the legal and fiscal reforms that had been desired in the late 1250s and which Edward had briefly supported were implemented, this time with royal consent. It is unclear what part Edward played in the debates over these changes. Indeed, it is difficult to determine what his exact role in government was at all in the late 1260s. Disputes arose frequently involving him, one with the Earl of Gloucester, over their overlapping jurisdictions around the town of Bristol. There is some evidence of Edward being involved in royal councils, but certainly not on the scale that one would have assumed would be the case given his prominence in ending the war, though he did receive extensive estates in the land confiscations that followed the conflict. Overall, it had been a mixed political apprenticeship for him. He had gained extensive experience as a military commander and to a lesser extent as an administrator, but Edward had also gained a reputation, one which is perhaps overstated at times, for being politically manipulative, someone who had been willing to throw in his lot with his father's enemies in the late 1250s, but then change sides quickly in the early 1260s. Despite his father's increasing old age and infirmity, Edward became determined in the late 1260s to depart on a crusade to the Holy Land. The Crusades had been a central pillar of life in Europe during the High Middle Ages. Beginning in the 1090s, the papacy had begun urging Christendom's monarchs, lords, and knights that it was their solemn duty, as the faithful of God, to try to reclaim the Holy Land, and the city of Jerusalem in particular, from the Muslim heathens there. A first crusade in the final years of the 11th century had proved enormously successful, with Jerusalem and several other cities such as Antioch and Acre captured and 4 Crusader states established. However, in the course of the 12th century, these had declined and Jerusalem was eventually conquered by the Muslim Lord Saladin in 1187. Despite a concerted effort by Edward's great-uncle, King Richard the Lionheart, to reclaim it during the Third Crusade in the early 1190s, the city remained out of Christian hands, and the other Crusader states continued to decline into the 13th century, despite numerous further crusades. Edward's father had long hoped to head on crusade himself, but now Edward took up the mantle for him. In the early 1170s, Edward would head on what was to be the 9th Crusade, but which is typically referred to as Lord Edward's Crusade. Such was his centrality to it. It was preached in response to the threat posed to the remaining Christian presence in the Levant by the Mamluk Sultan Baybars. When the crusade had been called by the Pope, the French king and his sons had agreed to take the cross and travel to the Holy Land. As a consequence, Edward possibly felt duty-bound to do so on behalf of the English royal family, though there is little doubting that he was also an enthusiastic participant. The expedition was funded in part by the Crown, but Edward bore a considerable amount of the expenses through his own household, a not inconsiderable burden. Approximately 225 knights agreed to travel with the prince, and these were complemented by several hundred further troops and auxiliaries. Most of these were royalists who had fought on the Crown's side in the civil conflicts in England of the 1250s and 1260s, and there was a reluctance by many of those lords who had only recently reconciled with the Crown to engage in the royal expedition. As a result of all this, the crusade which set off from England in the summer of 1270 was a decidedly small one by comparison with some of its forebears. Recruitment had been difficult, and even the financing precarious, and based to a considerable extent on a loan of £17,500 from King Louis IX of France, the leader of the much larger French contingent, with plans for some taxes to be raised in England to pay for it retrospectively. Edward's army was travelling behind the much larger French contingent, and when he finally caught up with them in the late autumn of 1270 at Tunis in North Africa, he learned that King Louis IX had died of dysentery some weeks earlier. There, the new leader of the French contingent, Charles of Anjou, entered into a negotiation with the Emir of Tunis whereby the expedition would be diverted to Sicily in order to see to matters in Italy, where the French had become involved in the south of the country some years earlier. Edward was indignant with this diversion and instead elected to continue with his small contingent along the original route and headed eastwards as planned, landing at the Crusader stronghold of Acre in the Holy Land in mid-May 1271. The Lord Edward's crusade possibly scored an immediate victory upon his arrival. The Christian port was threatened by the Mamluk leader Baybars at the time, and some of the contemporary sources suggest that Edward's arrival prevented an onslaught on the town. However, the Arab sources are altogether less congratulatory of the English lord on this count. In any event, when Baybars did appear outside the walls of Acre early that summer, with far superior forces than Edward possessed, he could have almost certainly taken the town had he decided to besiege it. Edward's admittedly meagre forces spent over 6 weeks ensconced at Acre before finally making a foray to St. George de l'Aubin, about 25 kilometres from the town. The piercing summer heat and some food poisoning stalled any efforts to proceed further. A campaign against Kakun, about 65 kilometres from Acre in the early winter, was more successful and resulted in the defeat of a Muslim force outside the town, but the main citadel could not be taken, and the Crusaders eventually retreated to Acre once again. Ultimately, the issue was that little could be achieved with the very limited resources in men and money available to Edward following the French abandonment of the crusade a year earlier. Accordingly, it was not surprising when Hugh III, the King of Cyprus and titular King of Jerusalem, concluded a truce with Baibars to last 10 years in the early summer of 1272. Edward was angry at the decision, but the Cypriot king was anxious to take advantage of the willingness of the Mamluk leader to agree such terms, which had become necessary after a large foray by the Mongols into the Levant late in 1271 that temporarily threatened the Mamluk rear had quickly dissipated. Edward remained in the Holy Land until September 1272, during which time he held hopes of perhaps changing Hugh's mind, but the crusade was effectively over. Probably the most notable incident during Edward's time in the Middle East occurred one night in his bedchamber when he was attacked and almost killed by an assassin. It is unclear who ordered his death, as some accounts state it was Baibars, whereas others say it was ordered by a mysterious old man of the mountains who was a leader of a fanatical Islamic sect. During this attempt on his life, Edward was able to fend off and kill his assailant, but was stabbed with a poisoned knife during the struggle. His wife, Eleanor, according to accounts, then sucked the poison from the wound, possibly saving her husband's life in the process, and the two then left the Holy Land in September 1272, as it was evident that their lives were in danger and also that little more could be done to further the Christian cause. Edward set off on the return journey to England in September. He left behind a Crusader presence which was living on borrowed time. In the years that followed, pressure on Acre from the Mamluk and others continued, and Edward, like his contemporary monarchs across Europe, would receive repeated calls for further aid to be sent throughout the 1270s and 1280s. These were not heeded in any substantive way, and finally, in 1291, the Crusader presence in the Holy Land was brought to an end nearly 200 years after it began, when Acre fell to the Mamluks. Back in the autumn of 1272, Edward headed home via southern Italy. He was there by early 1273, where he learned the news that his father had died the previous November and that he was now King of England. However, despite receiving this information, he did not head hastily for England. Rather, he engaged in a slow journey through Italy and southern France before heading to Paris to pay homage to the new French king, Philip III, who was theoretically Edward's liege lord over his lands in France. Edward then visited those few meagre remaining possessions which England held on the continent in Gascony before finally returning to England in August 1274. By which time the country had been without a king for nearly 2 years. Plans for Edward's coronation had been underway well before his eventual landing in England on the 2nd of August 1274. Consequently, it was possible for the ceremony to be held just over 2 weeks later, on the 19th of August. Disputes invariably arose concerning precedence, with Edward's brother Edmund pushing for him to be given a greater role as he had acted as steward of the realm during Edward's absence, while a perennial argument at medieval royal coronations over the seniority of the Archbishops of Canterbury and York saw the latter excluded altogether from the ceremony. Otherwise, things went smoothly, and the celebration took place on a grand scale. An enormous banquet involving thousands of cows, oxen, pigs, and chickens was to be held, while other staple fare of the medieval and early modern periods, such as swan, cranes, and goats, were prepared. Westminster Abbey was redecorated at considerable expense. When the coronation finally came, it was the first to involve the coronation of both a king and queen of England since the Norman conquest over 200 years earlier. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Kilwardby, placed the crown on Edward's head, which he duly removed, affirming that he would not wear it again until the lands England had lost under his father were reclaimed. Thus did he affirm that it was the beginning of a new age. The man who had just become king is often represented as a dour Machiavellian, but this is not precisely accurate. Standing at 6 foot 2 inches, Edward acquired the name Longshanks on account of his unusual height at a time when few men reached 6 foot. By the time he was crowned, the blonde hair of his youth was beginning to darken, and it would turn grey in his middle years. He spoke with a very slight lisp, but with purpose and persuasively. In religious terms, he was orthodox and made the conventional donations to churches and monasteries while hardly being possessed of anywhere near the religious devotion of his father. He was probably not well read, but expressed his cultural proclivities through his patronage of architecture and painting, notably supporting Walter of Durham, who did much to decorate the interiors of Westminster Abbey. By disposition, he could be good-natured and amiable, but also prone to violent outbursts. He enjoyed hunting and was a keen supporter of the tying of the Arthurian legend to the English monarchy. Ultimately, though, his administrative abilities were limited in many ways, with very little understanding of the nuances of finance and logistics, but what he lacked in this regard he more than made up for with his sense of purpose and forcefulness, traits which had been lacking in an English monarch since the days of his great-uncle Richard the Lionheart over 70 years earlier. One of the first issues that arose for Edward as king back in England came from the west in Wales. The Normans had established a significant amount of control over Wales following their conquest of England in the 11th century, and that had been maintained and even strengthened for much of the 12th century, but the weakened state of the English crown during the reigns of Edward's grandfather and father had seen a succession of rebellions there by the Welsh princes, notably Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, in an attempt to re-establish Wales's independence from England again. However, ap Gruffydd failed to realise that the English crown's position was stronger by the 1270s. Therefore, Edward expected Llywelyn to pay homage to him as his ancestors had done as a matter of course. His grandfather, Llywelyn the Great, for instance, had paid homage to both King John and Henry III in the 1200s and 1210s. Thus, when Llywelyn invaded English territory in the March region, Edward considered it the actions of a rebellious subject and became determined to act against him. He was aided in this by the fact that ap Gruffydd had alienated several of the other Welsh princes who had sought refuge at the English court. Thus, in the summer of 1277, Edward, at the head of a great royal army of 15,000 men, advanced into northern Wales with a fleet in support. No violence was needed. Llywelyn realised that this overwhelming show of force was an indication that his ambitions needed to be tempered, and he came to terms with Edward through the Treaty of Aberconwy, whereby his authority was severely curtailed in Wales, and he agreed to pay a huge indemnity of £50,000 to the English crown. Consequently, the homage of the Welsh lords, which had been paid to kings such as Henry II in the 12th century, was quickly re-established under Edward. This certainly did not settle the matter. A new war broke out 5 years later in 1282, and on this occasion Edward faced a combination of the Welsh princes, many of whom had allied with him in 1277, but who were disillusioned at his failure to to sufficiently reward them for their aid in the aftermath of that invasion. Llywelyn's brother Dafydd initiated proceedings by attacking Harden Castle in April, which was followed by further attacks on English castles in the region. Edward showed a similar resolve to that which he had demonstrated 5 years earlier. As he perceived it, Llywelyn and the other Welsh lords were not independent princes of a foreign land, but rebels of a country long controlled by England who were refusing to pay proper homage to him as their monarch. This was a mindset which Edward would employ later towards England's northern neighbour as well. A large host was once again assembled and sent into northern Wales to surround the Ap Gruffudd stronghold in Snowdonia. When Llywelyn subsequently attempted to break out of the encirclement into central Wales, he was killed in action at Irfan Bridge on the 11th of December 1282, while efforts to continue to war by his brother Dafydd were ineffective. Thus, the last Welsh stronghold surrendered in April 1283, just 1 year after the war had commenced. Dafydd ap Gruffudd was handed over to Edward's government shortly thereafter and executed, thus breaking the resistance of the foremost opponents of English intervention in Wales. Victory in 1283 saw one of the most thorough English reductions of Welsh independence ever seen. The Statute of Wales was passed in 1284 and extended English systems of government into Wales. New English-style counties were created and English local government introduced. Many Welsh nobles were disinherited and their lands granted away to English followers of Edward. To cement this new imposition of English rule, a comprehensive programme of castle building was also undertaken at sites like Conwy, Carnarvon and Harlech. New towns quickly emerged at these same sites, and others such as Flint, Aberystwyth and Rhuddlan, while efforts were made to Anglicise existing Welsh towns. Yet there were limitations to all of this, and it should not be assumed that Edward I completed the English conquest of Wales. Rebellions broke out in 1287 and again in 1294, the latter requiring a huge injection of English military power. Almost 30,000 men were involved in one fashion or another before the revolt was finally suppressed in the spring of 1295. All in all, the endeavour distracted Edward from issues he was facing elsewhere by the 1290s and had cost the crown an enormous sum of £55,000 to crush, highlighting how precarious control over Wales would remain for many years to come. The issue of financing such armies as were employed in Wales at various points between the mid-1270s and the mid-1290s was a major concern for an administration that aimed to reassert English power in a substantial fashion on several fronts. A major overhaul of the English finances and government was undertaken as a result to increase the inflow to the exchequer. No sooner had Edward been crowned than he appointed a close ally, Robert Burnell, as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Burnell immediately announced a commission of inquiry into various aspects of the government finances and administration, the primary purpose of which was to identify concealed lands which the Crown had title to, but records of which had been lost. Though the results were mixed, this inquiry did influence the formation of the extensive Statutes of Westminster, which were promulgated in the spring of 1275. This was the first of several acts down to 1290 which sought to end abuses of land tenure and the sub-infeudation of land whereby the lords were robbed of their feudal dues. The rights of tenants were also seen to, while the Crown sought to restrict the Church and others from granting away lands without royal approval, the better for the Crown to receive its own income from such transactions. Overall, this legislation constituted major changes to the Crown finances, landholding, and issues of debt in medieval England. While the inquiry of 1274 and the resulting Statutes of Westminster in 1275 began the process of reforming certain elements of landholding and other issues pertaining to the Crown, they did not solve the fiscal problem. Additional financial measures were introduced as a result in 1275. A customs duty of 6 shillings and 8 pence was placed on sacks of wool being exported from England. The English cloth trade at the time was very considerable, and this modest customs duty yielded approximately £10,000 a year into Edward's exchequer, a sum equivalent to tens of millions of pounds today. Added to this was a one-off tax of 1/15 of the value of movable goods, a medieval wealth tax of sorts which yielded upwards of £80,000. These measures were augmented by reforms to the running of the exchequer, while the Church also faced additional taxation from 1279 onwards. That same year, a recoinage was undertaken, a measure that was engaged in for the dual purposes of removing forged coins from circulation and gaining the Crown an additional financial windfall in its reissue of new coins. Such measures had to be undertaken regularly in an age when coin value was still based largely on the silver content of the coins in circulation. While these efforts at financial reform were broadly successful, they still did not prove sufficient for Edward's government to meet the cost of its wars over the years. For instance, when unrest arose in Wales again in the early 1280s, it took the Crown by surprise, and money had to be raised fast. Initially, the deficit was met by taking loans from the wealthy merchant communities of the towns, totalling over £16,000. When this proved insufficient to meet the military situation, regional assemblies were called for early in 1283 in the north of England and other districts. Italian merchant bankers such as the Riccardi family, whose influence as bankers extended across much of Western and Central Europe by the late 13th century, were also turned to. What all of this revealed was that despite how effective the reforms of the 1270s had been, England still could not finance a major war effort for an extended period of time without resorting to extraordinary measures to collect additional money. Consequently, further reforms of the exchequer were undertaken in the 1280s, notably the Statute of Rhuddlan, which aimed to improve bookkeeping and root out some of the corruption that was endemic in all pre-modern societies. These measures ultimately saw increasing efficiencies in the administrative apparatus of the English state during Edward's reign. All of this legislation and fiscal improvement of the 1270s and 1280s played out against a backdrop of parliamentary reform. Today, the Magna Carta, which was passed in the dying months of King John's reign, is typically seen as the great constitutional event of the High Middle Ages in England. But this is generally overstated. While it ensured some rights to the English nobility and their relationship with the Crown, the more significant developments in Parliament, the Legislative Assembly which would go on to become the mother parliament of modern democracy, actually began to occur during Edward's reign. For instance, it was Edward who oversaw the beginnings of the system whereby parliamentary members were returned down to the modern era. This stipulated that 2 knights were to be returned to Parliament from every county and 2 burgesses from every corporate town, a system which began to implement national representation for the first time. This presaged the constituency system which most modern democracies elect their parliaments according to today. In addition, Edward established a tradition in his first parliament of 1275 of asking Parliament for permission for extraordinary taxation, a development that was designed to avoid the constitutional conflicts that had dogged his father and grandfather's reigns. In the process, Edward's major contribution to parliamentary developments in England was to establish a reciprocal relationship between Crown and country. The Crown and government could request taxes, and the country could ask for favours and reforms in return. This system would operate effectively until the 17th century. There were administrative and financial successes elsewhere. Though events in Ireland are generally little commented upon in studies of Edward's reign, there were significant developments there during his 40-plus years in power. Much of the country had been first conquered by England in the late 12th century, though some parts of it remained outside of English rule. It was still expanding during Edward's reign, though based largely on the initiative of the English lords there. Two measures are notable, though. A lay subsidy tax was initiated in 1292, and this was used in the years that followed to fund the establishment of a new Irish Parliament with elected representatives, which met officially for the first time in 1297. It would last for over 500 years until the Act of Union subsumed the Irish Parliament into the English Parliament at Westminster. In addition to this, Edward's reign saw a notable strengthening and expansion of the court system in Ireland, which centralised courts in Dublin and regional courts in the provinces, dispensing justice under the common law. As a result of all this, Ireland generated a healthy profit for the English exchequer by the end of Edward's reign, and English political commentators on Ireland of the early modern period would look back from a vantage point of over 250 years and view the early 14th century as the heyday of English rule in Ireland. A further issue which impacted on the finances of Edward's kingdom was the position of the Jewish people. A sizable Jewish population had emerged in England during the late 11th and 12th centuries. As elsewhere in Europe, many Jewish people began working as moneylenders, as this was a profitable endeavour, and the Roman Catholic Church forbade Christians to practice usury, the loaning out of money at extortionate rates. Therefore, by the early 12th century, the Jewish community in England was playing a role in the economic life of the country that was significant, considering their actual numbers. This coincided with a growing anti-Semitism in England. Jews were perceived by medieval Christians as being guilty of deicide, the murder of God, in having called for Jesus' execution. This, combined with the issue of Jewish moneylending and role in the economy, had led to increasing persecution of the country's Jewish community during Edward's father's long reign, notably in extorting heavy sums of money from the country's Jews through extraordinary taxation on them and the application of heavy pressure on the country's Jewish people to convert to Christianity. Edward increased these anti-Semitic policies as soon as he became king. In 1275, the Statute of Jewry was passed, which outlawed Jewish people from practicing usury, relieving many of those who owed money to Jewish moneylenders of their debts, confining the Jewish people into ghettos in certain towns and cities, and forcing those over 7 years of age to wear a yellow badge marking them as Jewish. Taxes specific to all Jews over 12 years of age were also introduced. These extremely punitive measures were only in effect for 15 years, for in 1290 Edward, having determined that many Jewish people continued to act as moneylenders across the country, decided to expel the Jewish population from England altogether. Edward had just returned from a journey to his French possessions in Gascony in the late 1280s, and needed to levy additional taxes to pay for the campaign. To make this more acceptable to the nobility and gentry, he included a promise to expel the Jewish community from England, a measure which he duly followed through on in 1290. This carried the additional benefit that Edward was able to confiscate Jewish lands and properties into crown possession and sell them off at a financial windfall. The expulsion was carried out relatively quickly, with perhaps between 2,000 and 3,000 Jewish people exiled from England in the early 1290s, often heading for Eastern Europe, which was much more tolerant of their presence. Some small few remained in England, disguised as Italian bankers. Like each of his predecessors, Edward was concerned with France, though in a different manner to previous kings of England. His father had reached agreements with the French in the 1250s which effectively reconciled the English crown to the loss of the extensive territories in northern France, above all the Duchy of Normandy, which King John had lost in the 1200s. As such, there was not the same requirement of Edward to attempt to re-establish English control over Normandy and other areas as had been the case in the early years of Henry's reign. Nevertheless, the English crown retained a considerable presence in France, controlling Gascony in the southwest of France, and this necessarily involved Edward in French affairs. He visited Gascony several times, often in an effort to launch reform campaigns there, and most notably in the late 1280s. This resulted in a major series of reforms that were agreed in 1289 and which sought to regulate the conduct of the senior English officials in Gascony, the seneschal of the region and the constable of the town of Bordeaux. Yet what remained the major problem for Edward in Gascony was that he held the region as a fief of the French monarch rather than in his own right, a situation which in the 1290s would lead to war. Edward had maintained good relations with King Philip III of France, who had succeeded his father following Louis IX's death at Tunis on his journey to the Holy Land back in 1270. Edward had paid homage to Philip when passing through France on his return home from the Crusades in the mid-1270s, and he paid a visit to Paris again in 1279. Outstanding differences between the two crowns had been resolved on this occasion, leaving Anglo-French relations in a good place. Relations between Edward and the new monarch Philip IV, who succeeded his father in 1285, were also good, which makes the outbreak of war in the 1290s between England and France something of an unusual development. The cause was a localized conflict between England and some French merchant sailors operating in the English Channel. Edward felt his move against these elements in his capacity as King of England was entirely justified, but Philip viewed it as an act of rebellion by Edward as Duke of Aquitaine, the title he bore as Lord of Gascony. Thus, the war which broke out in 1294 was a result of Edward's overlapping jurisdictions as both an equal of the King of France, as King of England, while also being a subject of the King of France, as Duke of Aquitaine. After some military engagements in the English Channel with the French merchant vessels there, Philip summoned Edward to Paris to account for his actions. The English monarch was unwilling to show obeisance to a fellow monarch in this fashion, and so sent his brother Edmund on his behalf. A compromise was reached at this point whereby Edward would hand over some minor fortresses as surety in Gascony, while Edward would marry Philip's sister, Margaret, a woman nearly 40 years his junior. Edward's first wife, Eleanor, had died in 1290 after 36 years of marriage, meaning Edward could marry the French king's sister as a means of resolving the dispute which had arisen in the English Channel. However, the entire arrangement turned out to be a ruse on Philip's part, in order to have the Parlement of Paris vote through the confiscation of the Duchy of Aquitaine from Edward. With the outbreak of outright war, Edward's plans also changed, and he now began to develop ambitions to reacquire some of the territories lost by his grandfather 90 years earlier. Edward's strategy from early on in the war was to develop a major alliance of continental powers against the French. In particular, he sought allies amongst the many principalities of the Low Countries and Western Germany, which in the late medieval period were divided into dozens of small dukedoms, counties, and city-states, and with the powerful Duke of Burgundy, who controlled extensive territories in eastern France. In this way, Edward hoped to build up a power base in the Low Countries around the Duchy of Brabant and the counties of Gueldre and Holland, whereby England would strike into northeastern France towards Paris, rather than operating out of Gascony, as the French would suspect. This action was delayed until 1297, by which time the English had encountered mixed fortunes in their clashes with the French in Gascony. In any event, the military campaign in the Low Countries turned into a costly debacle, from which Edward only managed to extricate himself in the spring of 1298. Thus, this strategy proved a consummate failure in the final years of the 13th century, but the idea of building an alliance of European allies and striking against France from the Low Countries was one that would be employed effectively by Edward's grandson against the French many years later. The failure of Edward's Grand Alliance ended the most intense period of the war against France, but it took some considerable time for the war to be brought to a conclusion, even following the negotiation of a truce late in 1297. In 1299, a major step was taken when the previously negotiated marriage between Edward and Philip's sister Margaret finally took place. The couple, who had a 40-year age gap, were married at Canterbury on the 10th of September 1299. Despite the difference in their ages, the marriage was a relatively satisfactory one for both parties, with Margaret bearing Edward 2 sons and a daughter, and she never remarried after Edward passed away several years later. Meanwhile, final peace terms between England and France were finally ironed out in 1303, with a virtual return to the status quo ante bellum. The war had been a costly fiasco for both parties. Military operations in Gascony alone had cost Edward's exchequer approximately £350,000, while over £150,000 was paid in contributions by the English government to the small states of the Low Countries and Germany to win over their aid in the 1290s to almost zero benefit. Such was the massive cost of the war that a formal coronation as Queen for Margaret was never held to avoid the expense. This expense in France and the Low Countries was a particular annoyance for Edward, as in the course of the war the primary goal of his foreign policy had switched from France to Scotland. King Alexander III had died there in 1286, leaving his 3-year-old granddaughter, Margaret of Norway, as his heir. But Margaret died in 1290, bringing to an end the direct line of King William the Lion, which had ruled Scotland for over 120 years. There were now over a dozen contenders for the Scottish crown, but the 2 foremost were Robert Bruce, 5th Lord of Annandale, and John Balliol, Lord of Galloway. In order to prevent the country sliding into civil war, the Council of Guardians, which had been appointed in Scotland to govern during Margaret's youth, appealed to King Edward to act as an arbitrator. Edward now viewed this as an opportunity to re-establish a greater degree of English influence over Scottish affairs. As with Wales, Edward viewed Scotland as a subordinate part of the Kingdom of England, one which England had exercised a significant amount of influence over since the late 11th century, when William the Conqueror and his successor William II had established a degree of Norman control over the northern kingdom. While this had lagged in the course of the century prior to his accession, Edward viewed the succession crisis as a good opportunity to reassert English royal power in Scotland. Accordingly, after he supported the candidacy of John Balliol, who became King John I in 1292, Edward made it clear that he now considered Balliol a vassal who was expected to pay homage to him, and Scotland as a quasi-subject kingdom. Balliol and the Scots, however, were unwilling to countenance this, and after war broke out between England and France in 1294, Balliol not only refused to send Scottish troops to aid Edward, but entered into negotiations with the French to form an alliance. This was largely the trigger for Edward's decision to invade and occupy Scotland in 1296. Edward ordered an army to prepare at Newcastle upon Tyne in March 1296. At the same time, he sent envoys north with demands of the Scots that they hand over the border castles of Roxburgh, Jedburgh, and Berwick as surety against any potential alliance they might form with the French. The Scots not only refused this, but a Scottish army led by John Comyn, Earl of Buchan, moved south into England against Carlisle Castle on the 26th of March 1296. Here, Edward had appointed Robert Bruce, 6th Lord of Annandale, as governor of Carlisle Castle. It is indicative of how some Scottish lords at the time did indeed view Edward as a sovereign with some considerable rights over Scotland, that they were willing to engage in service to the English monarchy even within England. Bruce's son and namesake would play a major role in the events which would follow over the next 30 years in Anglo-Scottish relations. Comyn failed to seize Carlisle Castle, though his forces did set fire to the town, while further border raids followed by the Scots throughout April. This, however, was as good as military affairs would proceed for the Scottish in 1296. In late March, Edward led his forces across the River Tweed into Scotland. They seized Berwick, at that time the southern outpost of Scotland, within days, and Edward made his headquarters here for some time while he planned his next move as the Scots prepared their forces near Dunbar Castle, a few miles up the coast of Scotland from Berwick. It was here that the early stage of what would become a long 30-year war between England and Scotland would be decided. The Battle of Dunbar was fought between Edward's forces, led by John de Warenne, 6th Earl of Surrey, and the Scots, led by John Comyn, Earl of Buchan, on the 27th of April 1296. It appears from the surviving evidence that this was largely a clash between two relatively small cavalry forces consisting of perhaps a few hundred heavy cavalry on both sides. The Scots held a strong position on the high ground, but their lines broke up when they believed that the English were leaving the field. Consequently, an organised English cavalry charge routed the Scots and sent them fleeing. About 100 Scottish lords and knights were taken prisoner, and the following day, when Edward appeared in person, Dunbar Castle surrendered. In the aftermath of the battle, several other major castles across lowland Scotland simply surrendered to Edward's invading forces. Edinburgh Castle held out, but also fell after a week-long siege. Thus, a brief campaign had ended in total victory for Edward. King John Balliol surrendered, hoping for mercy, but Edward had him stripped of his crown and sent him south to captivity in England. Shortly afterwards, Edward headed south himself with the Stone of Scone, the traditional inauguration stone of Scottish kings, in his train. The importance of this was clear. John was no longer King of Scotland, and the country would have no other king but Edward henceforth. Edward viewed this as the simple culmination of a process that had begun over 200 years earlier, when William the Conqueror and William II had begun asserting a degree of English control over Scotland. In the aftermath of the campaign of 1296, the government of Scotland was largely handed over to Englishmen, with English garrisons established at key locations throughout the country. However, the victory had ultimately been far too easily won, and the back had never really been broken on Scottish resistance. Moreover, as Edward became once again preoccupied with events in France, the opportunity was quickly presented in 1297 for a revolt. This was led by three individuals: Robert Bruce, who would many years later become a king of Scotland himself, was the grandson of Robert Bruce, who had been a contender to the throne back in the early 1290s before Balliol was made king. A second rebel leader was Andrew de Moray, a prominent esquire from northeastern Scotland. The third, and certainly the most famous, was Sir William Wallace. Despite latter depictions of him as a romantic rebel of the commons, Wallace was a member of the lesser nobility of Scotland. Acting independently of each other to begin with, the trio managed to incite popular revolts against English rule across the country, which culminated in a first major victory over English arms at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in September 1297. Moray was fatally wounded at Stirling Bridge, and Wallace was consequently chosen in its aftermath as Guardian of Scotland, a regent of sorts elected by the Scottish nobles in the absence of a Scottish monarch. For the time being, Edward was in no position to retaliate. In 1297, he was busy overseeing the long-planned, coordinated action with his erstwhile allies in the Low Countries. Perhaps most significantly, he faced the most serious bout of domestic unrest of his reign within England itself, as the nobility and church leaders expressed several grievances over the cost of the wars in France, Scotland and Wales, and the lack of proper consultation with them by the monarch. Edward, who was more than aware of the troubles fractious nobles had caused both his father and grandfather, moved swiftly to justify his actions, issuing a long letter in which he apologized for his recent overbearing rule, but arguing that this was needed to bring the wars to a swift conclusion. This did not entirely placate the nobles, who petitioned for an amendment to Magna Carta, the great charter which King John had agreed with his nobles in 1215 to enshrine respect of their rights. While this was not granted, there were promises made that the extraordinary requirements being made of the nobility would not be asked of them again. Inadvertently, the revolt in Scotland may have aided his cause, as when the Scots began raiding into northern England in the aftermath of the Battle of Stirling Bridge, it convinced many in England that Edward's pleas for extraordinary taxation and other requests at this time, in light of the emergency, were justified. Edward quickly responded to the incursion of the Scots when he returned to England from Flanders in the spring of 1298. A large army of upwards of 20,000 troops was quickly assembled and led north by Edward, many of them being Welsh infantry, which had been pressed into service to demonstrate their loyalty after the major Welsh revolt of the mid-1290s. They assembled at Roxburgh in late June, and it was from here that Edward proceeded north towards Falkirk. Here he met Wallace's army in the field on the 22nd of July, 1298. Edward's forces were far numerically superior to the Scots, but the large Welsh contingent was fractious. The Scots numbered some 6,000 men, comprising approximately 4,000 long spearmen, who formed into 4 schiltrons, hedgehog-like phalanxes used to break any charge including those by heavy cavalry. The gaps between these were then filled by approximately 500 cavalry and over 1,000 archers. These schiltrons had been used to devastating effect at the Battle of Stirling Bridge the previous year, but here they did not prove as effective, because Edward's cavalry was used to circle the Scots, holding their spearmen in place while thousands of Edward's crossbowmen and archers rained down projectiles on them. By the end of the day, both sides had lost upwards of 2,000 men, but for Wallace, whose forces were much smaller than Edward's, this was a devastating blow. Despite his triumph at Falkirk, Edward was unable to capitalise and re-secure control over all of Scotland in the months that followed, restricting his hold to the castles of the border region and southern Scotland. Moreover, developments in France and his marriage to Margaret ensured that Edward was yet again distracted by events elsewhere in 1299, allowing the Scots the opportunity to retake Stirling Castle following a lengthy siege. With the war in France all but over from late 1299 onwards, Edward was able to focus more on Scotland from 1300, but despite annual campaigns into the country, his cause was hampered by Wallace and the other Scottish leaders being unwilling to risk another major defeat, such as had occurred at Falkirk. As a result, Edward was fighting an enemy in the early 1300s that proved unwilling to meet him directly on the field of battle. But victory could be won by duplicity and diplomacy too. Robert Bruce was won over in 1302 to his cause by Edward, while peace in France the following year ended any hope of aid to the Scottish from that theatre. A year later, many of the Scottish lords came to terms with Edward after the English retook Stirling Castle. The Scottish cause was dealt a further blow in the autumn of 1305 when William Wallace was captured near Glasgow by John de Menteith, a Scottish knight loyal to the English crown, and handed over to Edward's government. He was taken to London, where he was hung, drawn and quartered at Smithfield on the 23rd of August 1305. Meanwhile, Edward moved to consolidate his hold over Scotland by appointing his nephew, John of Brittany, son of Edward's sister Beatrice, as Royal Lieutenant of Scotland, while English officials were also installed as Chancellor or Chamberlain within the Scottish government. This process continued down the ranks, with English constables appointed to oversee the border towns and castles, and sheriffs established in the lowland regions as well. The near-total victory which Edward had once again won was emphasised in the decision to appoint English judges to some of the positions on the Scottish bench, while a review of the Scottish legal system to streamline it with the English common law was initiated. As with the decision to remove the royal inauguration stone from Scone in 1296, further symbolic gestures were made to emphasise Scottish subjugation, notably the reference around this time in English correspondence to Scotland as land rather than as a kingdom. Edward's victory in 1305 was to prove as ephemeral as that which he achieved in 1296. At a meeting at Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries near the Anglo-Scottish border on the 10th of February 1306, between Robert Bruce and Robert Comyn, the only two viable remaining candidates for the Scottish throne, Bruce killed Comyn. The cause of the quarrel was that Comyn attempted to renege on an agreement whereby one of them would relinquish their claim to the throne in return for a grant of lands that would make him the primary magnate in all of Scotland, while the other would become king. When Comyn reneged, Bruce killed him, and 5 weeks later he had himself proclaimed as King of Scotland, ending a 10-year hiatus during which Edward had effectively ruled the northern kingdom with no monarch north of the border. The inauguration was symbolically performed at Scone, the traditional site for the crowning of Scottish kings, despite Edward's seizure of the inauguration stone and bringing of it to England 10 years earlier. Some royal robes were brought out of hiding to solemnize the occasion. As he did so, Robert launched a new rebellion against English rule in Scotland. Bruce's decision to revolt early in 1306 might well have been a propitious move designed to exploit Edward's increasingly poor health. By now, the king was nearing his 70th year, a ripe old age by the standards of the late Middle Ages. Despite his infirmity, a substantial army was nevertheless readied under the command of Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, and Henry Percy, and sent north together with a further force under the command of the Prince of Wales, the future Edward II. In the meantime, Edward became incredibly vindictive following this latest setback in a war he had been trying to win for 10 years, and was determined to demonstrate that he considered this to be a treasonous rebellion by his own subjects, rather than actions occurring in an independent kingdom. As a result, many prominent Scots residing in England were executed in the course of the summer and autumn of 1306 for having tenuous links to Bruce, while others were imprisoned in cages on public display at some of the border fortresses in southern Scotland, a highly unusual punishment for the time. The initial campaign did not proceed well for Bruce. Having advanced into Scotland, de Valence parleyed with Bruce at Methven in mid-June 1306, with their forces on the field. It being late in the day, both sides agreed to wait to do battle until the next day, but as Bruce's forces bivouacked several miles away that evening, de Valence's forces fell on the Scots in a highly dishonourable breach of the English commander's word. Heavy losses were sustained, and Bruce only barely managed to fight his way out of the slaughter. Then, on the 13th of September, the Prince of Wales captured Kildrummy Castle from the Scots, taking Bruce's brother Nigel captive and several other senior supporters of the Scottish king. One of these, Sir Simon Fraser, was taken to London and executed despite having been a former courtier at the English court. This was in keeping with Edward's policy of showing no mercy towards any supporters of Bruce's cause throughout 1306. The king himself remained in no fit state health-wise to command on the field, and despite Bruce's campaign being at a low ebb in the autumn and winter of 1306, matters began to turn early in 1307. Bruce spent the winter either in the Hebrides of western Scotland or the Orkneys, building up his support in the Gaeltacht of Scotland, while possibly also visiting Ireland. Reinforced, he returned to the Scottish mainland early in the spring of 1307 and began a guerrilla war in southwestern Scotland. Ominous signs that Edward would not be able to reverse the situation again in Scotland were seen in April 1307, when Bruce first won a small victory over de Valence's men at the Battle of Glentrool, and then a much more decisive win at the Battle of Loudon Hill in Ayrshire. Here de Valence led as many as 3,000 men against a force of under 1,000 Scots led by Bruce, but the Scots utilised the terrain effectively to nullify de Valence's numerical superiority. Spearmen were used to the same effect as at Stirling Bridge years earlier to gain a major victory for Bruce over the English. Edward was apparently furious with these new reversals, which signified an end to the possibility of any quick overcoming of the fresh unrest in Scotland. This was the context in which King Edward I's life came to an end. Several weeks after the loss at Loudon Hill, he reviewed some of the English troops amassed at Carlisle Castle near the border before finally proceeding north towards Scotland, despite his poor health. His condition immediately deteriorated as he contracted dysentery, and while camped at Burr by Sands just south of the Scottish border on the morning of the 7th of July 1307, Edward Longshanks died. A tradition holds that Edward's deathbed wish was that his heart be carried to the Holy Land as part of a new crusade which the king had always had ambitions to launch, but had never found the time propitious to do so. He would have died that summer morning, in his 68th year, believing that much of his life's work was at least incomplete and perhaps heading towards failure, as Scotland had recently acquired its first king after a 10-year hiatus, and Bruce had won several victories on the field of battle against Edward's forces. Moreover, it must have been clear to him that no matter how often he sent large armies into Scotland and established a seeming control over the country, it always ended up in rebellion within months. He was succeeded by his son, Edward, Prince of Wales, with whom ominous signs of his reign being dominated by powerful favourites had already emerged. After a few further months of campaigning in Scotland, Edward headed south and was crowned king in February 1308. Edward's death ushered in a period of political, social and economic crisis in England. His son's 20-year reign was chaotic, with Edward II favouring a range of political favourites who aroused the enmity of the wider political community of England. This was compounded in the mid-1310s when a run of very poor weather struck Europe. In 1314, this led to nearly 150 days of continuous rain, followed by widespread harvest failures, which led to one of the most catastrophic famines in the continent's history. Simultaneously, an outbreak of a very virulent form of cattle disease occurred which saw livestock numbers plummet. Tens of thousands died across England as a result of these events. And while Edward II's successor in 1327, Edward III, proved a far more capable ruler, Europe was ravaged by one of the most catastrophic plague epidemics in human history, the Black Death, in the 1340s and 1350s, killing upwards of half of the population. It is perhaps a measure of the strength of the English state that had emerged by the end of Edward I's reign that his grandson, Edward III, was able to wage a sustained war against France to try to resurrect England's territorial empire on the continent in the face of such demographic and economic chaos as was wrought by the famines and plagues of the 14th century. Ultimately, however, Edward's efforts to bring Scotland under English rule ended in failure following his own death. In the late 1300s, Robert Bruce became the undisputed leader of the Scottish independence movement. As his forces grew, he placed ever greater pressure on the English presence in Scotland after victory at the Battle of Loudon Hill in the closing weeks of Edward's reign. Another battle was won at the Brander Pass in 1308 before expelling the English from Edinburgh. However, the ultimate conflict did not occur until 1314, when the Scots won a striking victory over Edward II's forces at the Battle of Bannockburn. A year later, Bruce's brother Edward invaded the north of Ireland, beginning a 3-year campaign designed to weaken England's resolve to remain in Scotland by opening a second front across the Irish Sea. Still, the war waged on, and in 1320 the Scottish nobility issued the Declaration of Arbroath, affirming their independence from England, a position which was given papal approval in 1324. Even so, it was not until a further major victory on the field of battle in 1327, at the Battle of Stanhope Park, that the war which Edward I had started over 30 years earlier was finally brought to an end with the Treaty of Edinburgh-Northampton in 1328, whereby England finally acknowledged Scottish independence and Robert Bruce as King of Scotland. King Edward's body was embalmed after his death in Scotland and brought south. It lay in state at Waltham Abbey for some time before he was finally buried in Westminster Abbey on the 27th of October 1308, nearly 4 months after his death. His tomb was fashioned in a plain manner from Purbeck limestone, a stone mined from the island of Purbeck in Dorset. This was not ornate, and there was no royal effigy added to the tomb. Incredibly, this austerity may have been owing to a lack of funds for a more sumptuous burial. Despite all the fiscal and administrative reforms of his reign, Edward's wars had been so costly that he had left England largely bankrupt. In 1774, the Royal Society of Antiquaries of London had the tomb opened, discovering that Edward's body was well preserved over 4.5 centuries later. An inscription was found on the tomb, badly faded by then, which had been added by the last abbot of Westminster, John Feckenham, in the mid-16th century. Part of it read Malleus Scotorum, which means the hammer of the Scots. Edward has subsequently come to be known by this title in recognition of the manner in which the war in Scotland came to define his reign, for good or for bad, and despite the ultimate failure of the endeavour. Edward I was one of medieval England's most significant monarchs, of that there can be no doubt. First and foremost, he reformed and revitalised crown government after decades of unrest under his grandfather and father, during which time there had been 2 civil wars, most of the French territories had been lost, and the Welsh princes had acquired de facto independence across much of Wales. The 1270s and 1280s saw royal government reconstructed in an impressive fashion, with reforms implemented to shore up English control over Gascony and Wales reconquered, with an extensive programme of Anglicisation undertaken there. Edward did not complete the conquest of Wales, but he contributed more than any other monarch to doing so. While many Welsh people would not view this as an achievement, if it is viewed purely from the perspective of a centralising state of the High Middle Ages, it constituted a considerable accomplishment of Edward's reign, one which forced the Welsh lords to once again pay homage to the English crown, and which furthered a process that had been initiated in Wales during the Norman conquest of the mid-11th century. At home, although he was not really an administrator himself, Edward appointed a number of capable individuals to senior ministerial positions, and these oversaw a programme of reform which reformed English land law, the collection of taxes, and various other measures which strengthened the English fiscal and administrative state and made it capable of waging the wars of the second half of Edward's reign. However, the problems of Edward's reign began to mount in the 1290s. From 1292, when he supported John Balliol's claim to the Scottish throne as a subject monarch, he was increasingly determined to bring Scotland under English rule. As with Wales, this must be viewed from the perspective of the late 13th century. Edward did not overtly perceive of himself as conquering a foreign nation. Rather, it was his view that he was reasserting a form of English rule in Scotland that had first been instituted under William the Conqueror and William II. Although it had lapsed in the intervening period to a considerable extent, he viewed the opportunity presented by the succession crisis there in 1290 as one through which he could force the Scottish lords to once again pay homage to him as their liege lord. However, matters became more complicated in 1294, when he became embroiled in a war with France, which presaged the 100 Years' War initiated under his grandson 40 years later. Edward's fleeting efforts in this respect proved enormously costly and yielded zero benefits to either him or the French. But it was in Scotland that things really turned sour. Edward must surely have felt like he had achieved a tremendous success in 1296 when he defeated the Scots and effectively subsumed Scotland into England, leaving the Northern Kingdom without its own king for the next 10 years, even one who had been selected by Edward to effectively act as a vassal like John Balliol was in 1292. But success in the north was always ephemeral. In 1297, Under figures like Wallace and de Mornay, the Scots rose successfully. Edward twice more seemed to have reduced them in 1298 and 1305, but on both occasions no sooner had he returned to England and the dust settled than a fresh revolt arose. The final one, by Robert Bruce, in early 1306, who made himself King of Scotland after a 10-year interregnum, was never fully subdued and eventually resulted in Scottish independence being reacquired many years later. What do you think of King Edward I? Was he one of England's most contradictory kings? One who created a powerful centralised English state, but one who also tarnished his legacy through his actions in Scotland and by his expulsion of the country's Jewish community? Please let us know in the comment section, and in the meantime, thank you very much for watching.